Pat the Night Security Chief Roland Mercer pressed the barrel of his sidearm against the chest of a nurse outside Harlow Ridge Veterans Medical Center. He was certain of one thing: she had no way to fight back. She was small, she was quiet, and she had just been stripped of her hospital badge by his own hand. He was grinning when he did it. What Roland Mercer did not know, what no one at Harlow Ridge knew, was that the woman standing in front of him had once neutralized a three-man ambush in a mountain pass in the dark, with 2 broken ribs and a dislocated shoulder, and walked her team out alive. Her name had not always been Claire Whitmore. For 10 years, it was Commander Claire Voss, Navy SEAL medical officer, and the people who knew that name did not say it lightly. If this story already has your attention, stay with me until the very end. Like this video, subscribe so you never miss what comes next, and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The hospital sat on the edge of Harlow Ridge, Montana, which was the kind of town that appeared on maps but rarely in conversation. A spread of low buildings, one main road, and a veterans medical center that serviced the entire northeastern corridor of the state. Silver-gray mountains framed it on 3 sides. In winter, the parking lot froze before midnight. In summer, the grass along the perimeter fence turned the color of straw. It was not a prestigious posting. Most of the staff who worked there had either chosen it deliberately or ended up there because nowhere else had called back. Claire Whitmore had chosen it deliberately. She had taken the nursing position 14 months ago, driving up from Billings in a truck that needed a new alternator, with 2 duffel bags and a framed photograph she never unpacked. She had told HR she was a travel nurse with ER experience. That was technically accurate. The experience had simply been acquired in field hospitals in Djibouti, on helicopter decks in the Pacific, and in a forward operating base outside Kandahar where the nearest trauma center was 400 miles and a prayer away. She did not mention any of that. What the staff at Harlow Ridge saw was a woman in her late 30s with dark hair pulled back, steady hands, and a way of moving through a crowded trauma bay that suggested she had never once panicked in her life. She worked nights mostly. She took the difficult patients, the ones who screamed, the ones who refused medication, the ones whose PTSD made them dangerous to approach. She had a way of talking to them that other nurses couldn't replicate, something in her voice that was low and certain and never performed calm. It was actual calm, the kind that came from having been somewhere worse. Her co-workers liked her. They didn't entirely understand her, but they liked her. The only person at Harlow Ridge who had taken an immediate and pointed dislike to Claire Whitmore was Roland Mercer. Mercer had been the head of hospital security for 6 years. He was a broad man with a thick neck and the particular confidence of someone who had never been seriously challenged in a space where he held authority. He had hired most of his own team, managed access to every wing of the building, and had cultivated relationships with 3 members of the hospital's administrative board that he was not shy about referencing when someone pushed back against him. He wore his uniform like it meant something. He walked the corridors like he owned them. The trouble between Claire and Mercer had started small, the way most institutional conflicts do, through a series of exchanges that individually seemed minor and collectively built into something that couldn't be walked back. It had started with Dani Reyes. Dani was 24, a licensed practical nurse 8 months into her first real hospital job. She was good at the work, quick with assessments, gentle with difficult patients, reliable in the way that supervisors noticed but rarely mentioned aloud. She was also exactly the kind of person Roland Mercer had decided he was entitled to make uncomfortable. Claire had noticed it 2 months in, the way Mercer would appear in whatever wing Dani was working, the way he'd lean against the nurse's station and let conversations go on longer than they needed to. The comments, nothing that would clear a formal complaint threshold on its own, but assembled together, relentless. Once, she'd seen Dani take a different hallway to avoid crossing his path, adding 4 minutes to a medication round. The night it came to a head, Claire was charting at the station when she heard Mercer's voice down the corridor, and then heard Dani's voice, quieter than it should have been, with an edge in it that wasn't argument. It was someone trying not to escalate a situation that had already gone wrong. Claire set down her pen and walked toward it. Mercer was standing too close. That was the first thing she registered. Dani had her back against the supply room door, her arms crossed, her face doing the specific thing that faces do when someone is choosing very carefully between responses. "Can I help with something?" Claire said. Mercer turned. He looked at her the way people look at an interruption they didn't ask for. Nurse business. Keep moving. I'm asking Danny if she needs anything. Danny's eyes cut to Claire's. A fraction of relief in them, a fraction of fear that this was about to get worse. She's fine, Mercer said. We were just talking. Danny, Claire said, keeping her voice even, not looking at Mercer. Do you want to finish the medication round? I'll cover the station. Danny said yes and left. Mercer watched her go, then turned back to Claire with something in his expression that had shifted. Less casual now, more deliberate. You just made a mistake, he said. I interrupted a conversation, Claire said. That's all this was. That's not all this was, and you know it. She looked at him directly, not aggressively. She had been trained to understand the difference between holding eye contact and escalating, and she knew which one this was. I know that Danny had somewhere to be. I know I helped her get there. That's all I know about this situation. She walked back to the station. It should have ended there. It didn't. The formal complaint came 9 days later. Mercer had filed it through administrative channels, citing Claire for interference with security protocol, unprofessional behavior toward a superior officer. He used that phrase, superior officer, which was not accurate by any organizational chart but which no one in administration appeared to question, and creating a disruptive environment. Claire read the complaint in the office of Dr. Patricia Holt, the hospital's director of nursing operations, who had the look of a woman who had absorbed too many institutional conflicts and was now primarily concerned with making this particular one stop. This is a formal reprimand, Dr. Holt said. It goes in your file. Mercer's team has authority over access and corridor management. The complaint says you interfered with his staff interaction protocol. He was cornering a junior nurse in a hallway. He says it was a routine check-in. It wasn't. Dr. Holt pressed her lips together. Claire, I believe you have good intentions. I do. But Mercer has direct board relationships. And this, she touched the complaint folder, this is not a battle you're positioned to win. I need you to sign the acknowledgement form. Keep your head down and let this go. And Danny? Nurse Reyes is fine. She hasn't filed anything. Claire looked at the form. She picked up the pen. She signed it. Not because she agreed with it, but because she had spent enough years in situations where tactical retreat was the correct move, and she knew what this moment was. She was being measured. She was being watched, and she did not yet have what she needed to fight this the right way. She left the office with the reprimand in her file and a clear understanding that Mercer had just told her, through official channels, that he intended to make her existence at Harlow Ridge as difficult as possible. She was not particularly alarmed by this. She had dealt with worse than Roland Mercer in places where the stakes were considerably higher. What happened over the following 3 weeks was systematic. Mercer began pulling access, first her keycard privileges to the secondary medication room. A small thing, inconvenient, officially justified as a security audit. Then her schedule was flagged in the internal system, requiring secondary sign-off on her shift changes, adding friction to every request she made. A note appeared in her file suggesting a patient had complained about her manner. The patient, when she quietly asked about it, had no memory of filing anything. She documented everything: date, time, the name of whoever had delivered each new restriction. She kept the notes in a small spiral notebook she carried in her coat pocket, not because she was certain she would use them, but because the habit of documentation was as natural to her as breathing. She had spent years in environments where what you could prove mattered more than what you knew. She also started paying attention to other things. Because when you paid careful attention to Roland Mercer, not just to his behavior toward nurses, but to his behavior in the parts of the hospital where he thought no one was watching, certain patterns emerged that had nothing to do with his conduct toward junior staff. The night delivery logs, for instance. Mercer signed off on supply chain deliveries that arrived after official hours, logging them in the system as routine pharmaceutical restocks. The documentation looked clean at first glance, but Claire had spent enough time studying field logistics to recognize when a paper trail had been constructed rather than accumulated. The timestamps didn't align with the receiving bay's automated security footage timestamps. Not by much, but enough. 15 minutes here, 20 minutes there. Enough time for something to arrive and be moved before the official record began. She didn't know yet what she was looking at, but she kept looking. Then, on a Wednesday night in the third week of February, everything accelerated in a direction she hadn't anticipated. What? The patient in room 14B had been admitted 4 days earlier under a name that wasn't his real name. She knew that because his intake form listed a service branch and a unit designation that she recognized, and the combination didn't line up with the civilian background his paperwork described. She had said nothing about this. People arrived at veterans' hospitals with complicated histories. It was not her place to interrogate them. His name in the system was Robert Hale. He was 51, recovering from a surgical repair of a femoral injury sustained in what the form called a hiking accident. He was polite, kept to himself, and had a specific way of positioning himself in his bed so that the door was always within his sight line. She knew that posture. She had taught people to sit that way. On Wednesday night at 11:40 p.m., she was doing rounds when she noticed his light was on and his door, which he always left slightly open, was closed. She paused outside it, listened. Nothing she could specifically identify, just a quality of silence that was too deliberate, the kind of quiet that had someone managing it from the other side. She pushed the door open. There were 2 men in the room who were not hospital staff. One was standing near the window. One was positioned beside the bed. Robert Hale was sitting upright with the specific stillness of someone who had been told to stay still, and his expression when he saw Claire was a precise mixture of relief and warning. He wanted her out of this room, and he was also glad she was in it. Visiting hours ended at 8, Claire said. Her voice gave nothing. The man near the bed turned. He was large, late 40s, wearing a jacket that had the shape of someone who was carrying something under it. "Get out," he said. "Patient's resting." "I'm his nurse. I need to check his vitals." "Come back in 10 minutes. I'm checking them now." She stepped into the room. She didn't move toward the bed yet. She moved to the right, to the vitals monitor on the wall, which put the bed between her and the man near the window and gave her a sight line to the door. She did this without appearing to think about it, because she didn't have to. The geometry of occupied spaces and where to position yourself within them was something she had stopped thinking about consciously around year 4. The man near the bed stepped toward her. "I said leave." "I heard you." She glanced at the monitor. Hale's heart rate was elevated, 94. His blood pressure was reading higher than his baseline. "Mr. Hale, are you in pain?" "I'm fine," Hale said. His voice was controlled. His eyes were not. "Okay." She made a notation on the tablet she was carrying, real notation, the kind that would appear in his record. "I'll flag this with the attending." The man near the window said something in a low voice, a single word, not English, and the man near the bed shifted his weight. Claire set the tablet down on the vitals cart, turned, and walked out of the room at a pace that was brisk without being a run. The moment she cleared the doorway, she pulled her phone and called the charge nurse station, not security, because she already understood that there was a reason those men were in that room and a reason they hadn't wanted her to see it, and she did not yet know which parts of Harlow Ridge's security apparatus she could trust. "I need a welfare check on 14B, she said. 2 unidentified individuals, neither in scrubs or staff ID. Patient presenting elevated vitals." "I'll send someone." "Send 2 people. Don't send them alone." She hung up and stood in the corridor, and for the first time in 14 months at Harlow Ridge, she let herself think about what she actually was and what she actually knew how to do. She had been deliberately not doing that. She had been, with real intention, trying to be just a nurse, to let that be enough, to let the things she had built here, the small, quiet life, the patients who recognized her in the hall, Danny's occasional grateful smile, let it be what she was. But the 2 men in that room had changed the geometry of the situation, and the spiral notebook in her coat pocket had 14 weeks of documentation about Roland Mercer. And somewhere in Harlow Ridge Veterans Medical Center, there was a paper trail that she was beginning to understand was not about pharmaceutical restocking. The charge nurse sent 2 people to 14B. The men were gone by the time they arrived, and Robert Hale declined to make a statement. Claire went back to charting. She did not sleep well that morning when her shift ended. The termination came on a Friday. She was called to the administrative wing at 2 in the afternoon, not by Dr. Holt this time, but by the hospital director himself, Lawrence Dunn, a man she had spoken to exactly twice in 14 months. He was seated behind a desk that was designed to communicate authority, and sitting to his right was Roland Mercer, in full uniform, with the particular expression of someone who had already won. Also present, a woman from HR named Sandra Kite, who would not make eye contact, and a hospital attorney on speakerphone who identified himself briefly and then went quiet. Dunn explained the situation with the measured diction of someone reading from a prepared statement, which he was. The complaint was a composite, multiple incidents, an allegation that Claire had physically intimidated a security officer during a corridor interaction, a claim that she had been observed exhibiting erratic and aggressive behavior by two witnesses whose names were not provided. Claire listened to all of it. She did not interrupt. "We're placing you on administrative suspension effective immediately," Dunn said. "Your badge will be deactivated. You'll need to vacate the premises before the end of the shift. HR will follow up regarding your final paycheck and any—" "Which corridor interaction?" Claire said. Dunn paused. "I'm sorry?" "The allegation about physical intimidation. Which corridor, which date?" He glanced at the HR folder. "February?" "I'll need that in writing," she said. "The specific allegation, the date, and the names of the witnesses." Dunn looked at Mercer. Mercer looked at Claire with the expression of someone who had not been expecting that particular response and was recalibrating. "You'll receive documentation today," she said, "before I leave the building. If I'm being suspended based on witness accounts, I'm entitled to know who the witnesses are." Sandra Kite made a note. The attorney on the phone cleared his throat. "We can arrange to have the documentation." "I'll wait," Claire said. What followed was 40 minutes of the particular institutional discomfort that occurs when someone who is supposed to quietly accept a process declines to do so. Mercer left the room twice. Kite produced several folders. The attorney on the phone was consulted 4 times. At the end of it, Claire was handed a document that was more detailed than the one they had initially prepared, and which, she noted, reading it carefully while they watched, contained language that was internally inconsistent in ways that would matter later. She folded it, put it in her coat pocket with the spiral notebook, and stood. "I'll be available for any legitimate process," she said. "I expect the documentation of the specific allegations to arrive within 48 hours. Mercer stood as she moved toward the door. He was smiling now, the particular smile of someone who had just watched something they arranged perform as expected. "You're done here, Whitmore," he said. "I want you to understand that. This isn't something you recover from." She stopped. She turned to look at him. She did not smile back. "I understand what you're saying," she said. "Thank you for making it clear." She left the administrative wing. She cleared her locker in 12 minutes, stopped at the nurse's station to say something brief and warm to Danny, who looked stricken and opened her mouth and then closed it again because she didn't know what to say. Claire told her everything was fine. That wasn't entirely true, but she said it in the tone she'd learned to use in the field, the one that settled people down without lying to them in any way that mattered. She was in the parking lot, keys in hand, when Mercer appeared behind her. He had followed her out. He'd brought one of his officers, a younger man named Pratt, who stood 6 feet away with the awkward expression of someone who had been brought along for a purpose he wasn't certain about. "I want you to know something," Mercer said, pulling his sidearm from its holster. Not raised, at his side, but visible. A message. He was watching her face for the flinch, for the fear. He wanted her to understand that she had no options and no protection, and that the things she thought she knew about the situation were not going to help her. "I want you to know you've got nothing," he said. "No job, no witnesses, no one in this building who's going to remember you as anything but a problem. Whatever you're planning, whatever you think you've got, it's not enough. You should go home, if you've got one." He waited. Claire looked at him. The parking lot was cold. February in Harlow Ridge meant temperatures that went into the negative numbers after sundown, and the wind was moving in from the mountain range to the west. Behind Mercer, the lights of the hospital were beginning to come on in the windows as the late afternoon grayed into evening. She did not look at the weapon. She did not look at Pratt. She looked at Roland Mercer, and she thought, not for the first time, that there was a very specific type of man who relied on the threat of force because he had never been in a situation where force was actually required. "You should put that away," she said quietly. "Excuse me?" "Your sidearm. Put it away. You're on hospital grounds. There are cameras on that south-facing corner." She didn't look at the camera, but she knew exactly where it was. "And you just pulled a weapon in front of a witness." She glanced at Pratt. "He's going to have to decide what he saw." Pratt was very still. Mercer looked at the camera. He looked back at Claire. Something moved through his expression that wasn't quite uncertainty. Men like Mercer rarely went all the way to uncertain, but was something adjacent to it. He holstered the weapon. "Get off these grounds," he said. "Of course," she said. "Have a good evening." She got in her truck. She drove out of the parking lot at a careful, legal speed. In the rear-view mirror, she watched Mercer watch her until she turned onto the access road and the hospital disappeared behind the tree line. She drove 2 miles. She pulled over onto the shoulder of the highway because the adrenaline was real, even when you knew how to manage it. And she sat there for 4 minutes with the engine running, breathing carefully, letting her heart rate come down to where she needed it. Then she pulled the spiral notebook out of her coat pocket, opened it to a fresh page, and wrote down the exact time, the exact location, and a precise description of what Roland Mercer had done in the parking lot. She wrote down Pratt's name. She wrote, "Firearm visible, unholstered, no elevation, intimidation intent evident, camera position confirmed." She capped the pen. She put the notebook back in her pocket. She had 14 weeks of documentation, a termination letter with internally inconsistent witness accounts, a memory of 2 unidentified men in a veteran patient's room, and a paper trail in the hospital's delivery logs that she had not yet been able to fully trace. What she did not have was time to be unhappy about any of this. Because somewhere back in Harlow Ridge Veterans Medical Center, a patient who had arrived under a false name and positioned himself so his door was always in view was still in room 14B, and the men who had visited him on Wednesday night had not been dissuaded by a welfare check. And on Saturday morning, she received a call from a number she recognized immediately. Not from her time at Harlow Ridge, not from anywhere in Montana, but from a secure exchange she had memorized 10 years ago and not used in 14 months. She answered it on the first ring. The voice on the other end said 6 words. "Voss, we have a situation at Harlow Ridge." Her hand tightened on the phone. Outside the windshield, the highway stretched north toward the mountains. The sky was the deep gray of late winter, and the first edge of evening was coming in from the east. She had not been Claire Voss in over a year. She had worked with real intention at becoming someone who didn't need to be. But the man in room 14B was still in that building, and the 2 men who had visited him had not left because they'd been interrupted. They had left because it had suited them to leave. And Roland Mercer, who had pulled a sidearm on her in a parking lot and smiled doing it, was still the head of security at a veterans medical center where something was happening that she did not yet fully understand. She had 14 weeks of documentation and a pen and a spiral notebook. She had something else too. Something she had tried very carefully not to need. "Tell me everything," she said. The voice belonged to Captain Dennis Farrow, and the fact that she recognized it immediately, despite 14 months of deliberate distance, despite the new name and the new life, and the careful construction of someone who had never operated in a forward position, told her something about the state of her own forgetting. She hadn't forgotten anything. She had simply stopped looking at it. "Farrow," she said. "How did you get this number?" "It's the same number you've had for 12 years, Voss. I go by Whitmore now." "I know what you go by." A pause. Not hesitation. Farrow didn't hesitate, he calculated. "The man in 14B, what do you know about him?" She kept her eyes on the highway. The light was failing fast, the way it did in February in Montana, collapsing from gray to dark without the gradual orange of warmer latitudes. "I know he's not Robert Hale. I know he came in with a unit designation on his intake form that didn't match his civilian backstory. I know 2 men visited him Wednesday night who weren't medical staff." "You read the intake form?" "I read everything." Another pause. Longer this time. "His name is Warren Tibbs, formerly NSA contractor, currently a material witness in a federal investigation involving the diversion of military-grade pharmaceutical compounds through civilian medical supply chains." He said it the way people delivered information they'd rehearsed, efficiently and without color. He was placed at Harlow Ridge as a temporary safe house arrangement while the primary location was being secured. Someone in that arrangement leaked his position. Claire sat with that for a moment. Outside, a truck passed heading south, its headlights sweeping the shoulder briefly, and then the highway was dark again. "The delivery logs," she said. "Say that again." "Harlow Ridge has irregular delivery logs. After-hours supply chain sign-offs that don't match the receiving bay timestamps. I've been documenting it for about 6 weeks. I thought it was procurement fraud." She paused. "It's not just procurement fraud." The silence on the other end had a different quality now. She could hear Pharaoh breathing, which meant he was processing faster than he was speaking, which had always been true of him. How detailed is your documentation? Detailed enough. Voss? Whitmore. I don't have time for that right now, he said, and there was something in his voice that moved past professional urgency into something closer to actual concern, which from Pharaoh was notable. The two men you encountered Wednesday. We have reason to believe they're coming back. Tonight. And based on what you just told me about those delivery logs, we have reason to believe they may have an internal contact. The word settled in the truck cab like something physical. Internal contact. She looked at the dark shape of the tree line against the sky and thought about Roland Mercer and his after-hours delivery sign-offs and his direct board relationships and the particular ease with which he had built a case against her. A case so quickly and cleanly assembled that it had almost suggested prior preparation. How many people know Tibbs is at Harlow Ridge, she asked. On our end, 7. On the hospital's end, a pause that carried something uncomfortable in it. That's what we're trying to determine. Mercer, she said, not a question. We don't have confirmation. I have 6 weeks of delivery logs that don't add up, and a termination filed 3 days after I saw those men in Tibbs's room. She let that sit. That's not confirmation, but it's something. It's something, Pharaoh agreed, which is why I'm calling you. You're calling me because your safe house has been compromised, your witness is exposed, and you need someone who knows that building. I'm calling you because you're the best medical operator I've ever worked with, and you're already on the ground, and this situation has moved past the point where we can afford to wait for a team to position. A beat. I'm also calling because I thought you'd want to know, given what you apparently walked into today. She looked at the notebook on the passenger seat. 14 weeks of careful, quiet documentation. A life she had been building with the particular attention of someone who understood how fragile, deliberately chosen lives could be. What's the timeline, she said. We believe they move on Tibbs tonight, somewhere between midnight and 0300. She checked the clock on the dash. It was 6:47 p.m. I need everything you have on the two men, she said, and I need to know who else you're sending. Team is 6 hours out minimum. Montana positioning is 6 hours, she said flatly. It's a rural installation, Claire. He had used her actual first name. That told her something too. Send me what you have. Encrypted channel, old key. She was already running the math, 5 hours and change until a federal team arrived. Warren Tibbs alone in a room with a door that kept entering his sightline. Roland Mercer inside the building with whatever access he had decided to use and whatever arrangement he had decided to honor. And Pharaoh. Yeah. I'm suspended. My badge is deactivated. I can't walk through the front door. A pause. I'm sure you'll figure something out. She ended the call. She sat for exactly 90 seconds, which was the amount of time she allowed herself to be unhappy about situations before shifting to operational thinking. Then she started the truck and made a U-turn on the empty highway, heading back toward Harlow Ridge. She didn't go to the hospital first. She went to Donnie Reyes. Danny lived in a rented house 8 minutes from the hospital campus, a small place with a porch light that was on when Claire pulled up at 7:15. She knocked. Danny answered in scrubs. She was on the night shift, starting at 11, which Claire had known. Claire. Danny's face moved through several things quickly. Relief, worry, the specific discomfort of someone who felt guilty about something they hadn't done. I heard what happened today. I'm sorry. I should have... When they asked me about the corridor incident, you told the truth, Claire said. Whatever you said, it was true. That's all that matters. She looked at her steadily. I need something from you. You can say no. I want you to know that clearly. You can say no, and it won't change anything between us. Danny was quiet for a moment. What is it? Your badge still works. Understanding moved across Danny's face slowly, and then all at once, the way it did with people who were smart but didn't want to arrive at the destination. Claire, the patient in 14B is in danger, not hospital danger, actual danger, from people who are coming back tonight. I can't walk through the front door, but I know that building and I can handle what's coming. I just need to get inside. Danny stared at her. What kind of danger? The kind I know how to deal with. That's not an answer. No, Claire said. It isn't. And I'm asking you to trust me without the full answer, which is not a fair thing to ask, and I know that. Silence. The porch light hummed. Down the street, a dog was barking at something in the dark. Danny reached into the pocket of her scrubs and took out her access card. She held it out. Her hand was not entirely steady. "If you get me fired, I will personally write your reference letter," Claire said. "And I'm very good at reference letters." Something in Danny's expression broke towards something warmer, complicated and worried and warmer. "Be careful." "Always," Claire said, which was not entirely true, but was the right thing to say. She parked in the maintenance lot, which was behind the east wing, and had a camera with a known blind spot she had identified in month 2 by watching where the security guards positioned themselves during smoke breaks. She had noted the blind spot the way she noted most things, not because she expected to need it, but because knowing exit geometry was a habit too deep to switch off. She went in through the laundry service entrance at 9:22 p.m. using Danny's badge, moving quickly and without the particular self-conscious speed that drew attention. She had changed into civilian clothes, dark pants, dark jacket, nothing that announced itself. She had her phone, her notebook, and a small trauma kit she kept in the truck out of a habit she'd never broken. The East Wing at night had the specific quality of a building that was occupied but not observed. Staff concentrated at the nursing stations, long corridors with motion sensor lighting that clicked on a second and a half after you stepped into them. She moved through it knowing exactly where each camera was positioned and where its coverage ended. She went to the records room first. It was a calculated choice. She had 20 minutes before the delivery schedule she'd identified would put Mercer's contact in the supply corridor 2 floors up, which meant Mercer himself was either in his office or doing rounds, and either way she had a window. The records room required a level 3 access badge, which Danny's card covered. She was not interested in patient records. She was interested in the internal security logs, the ones that tracked badge access to every door in the building, time-stamped and linked to individual badge IDs. She had wanted to pull these for 6 weeks and had lacked the access level. Now she didn't. She found what she needed in 11 minutes. The delivery logs she had been tracking manually showed after-hours supply entries on 9 separate dates over the past 4 months. The badge access log showed a single badge, Roland Mercer's master credential, opening the rear pharmaceutical receiving bay within 10 minutes of each of those entries, every single time. On 3 of those occasions, a second badge had also been scanned, an ID number she didn't recognize, not linked to any current staff member in the active employee database. She photographed everything with her phone, 12 photographs. She sent them to Pharaoh's encrypted channel with a message, internal, confirmed. RC credential plus ghost badge, 9 incidents. I have the timestamps. Pharaoh's response came back in 4 minutes. Hold position. Do not engage. Team ETA revised to 4.5 hours. She looked at the timestamp on his message. Then she looked at the window. Actual window, east-facing, overlooking the parking lot. The temperature outside had dropped below 0. The access road into Harlow Ridge had 1 main route and 2 service tracks. A vehicle with intent could be on site in under 8 minutes from the highway. 4.5 hours. Tibbs was in room 14B with a compromised security chief somewhere in the building and 2 men who had already demonstrated they knew where to find him. She typed back, "Understood. I'll hold." She did not entirely mean it. What? She was in the stairwell on the north side of the building at 10:45 p.m. when she heard the first thing that told her the timeline had moved up. It was not a sound that would have meant anything to most people. A brief, specific radio burst from 2 floors below. The kind of transmission that cut out mid-word, the way they did when someone switched from an open channel to an encrypted one. But she had spent years in buildings where radio protocol meant the difference between a situation that was managed and one that wasn't. And the switch from open to encrypted in a hospital setting meant either a serious patient event or something that someone didn't want the standard network to hear. She stayed still. She listened. 20 seconds of nothing, and then, faint, below her, the sound of boots that were not moving the way hospital staff moved. Staff moved with a particular cadence built around not disturbing patients, quieter on the upstroke, deliberate spacing. These footsteps were purposeful in a different way. They were covering ground. She went up, not down. 3rd floor, then 4th, and then she was in the south corridor moving toward room 14B, and she could see from 60 feet away that the door was closed. The same closed door quality it had had on Wednesday night. the kind that meant something was wrong with what was behind it. She did not run. Running attracted attention and made noise and narrowed options. She moved fast and arrived at the door in 19 seconds and listened for 2. And what she heard through the door was a man's voice, low and controlled, saying something she couldn't fully make out. And Robert Hale, Warren Tibbs, saying nothing at all, which was worse than if he'd been saying something. She pushed open the door. The room had 3 occupants. Tibbs was in the bed exactly where he'd been 3 days ago, positioned exactly the same way. The man near the window was the same one who had been there Wednesday, large, late 40s. There was a second man she hadn't seen before, younger, positioned near the door. And standing at the foot of the bed, holding a tablet and speaking in a quiet, unhurried tone, was Roland Mercer. He looked up when she came in. For a moment, just a moment, his face showed something that wasn't quite surprise, because he was not a man who showed surprise easily, but was the expression of someone whose timeline had just been interrupted. "Whitmore," he said, "you need to leave this room." She stepped inside. She let the door fall shut behind her. The younger man near the door shifted, and she tracked that movement with her peripheral vision without looking directly at him, because looking directly would have told him he'd been noticed, and right now she wanted him to think he hadn't been. "I'm checking on my patient," she said. "You're suspended," Mercer said. "You're trespassing. You're going to leave now, or I'm going to have you removed." "Mr. Tibbs," she said, ignoring Mercer entirely. "How are you feeling?" Tibbs looked at her. His face had the quality of a man who was keeping himself very carefully in one place, internally. "I've had better nights," he said. "That's honest." She looked at Mercer. "What are you doing in this room at 11 p.m., Roland?" "Conducting a security check. With an unregistered visitor and a man who doesn't work here." She glanced at the large man near the window, then at the younger one by the door. "Harlow Ridge's security protocols don't include civilian contractors in patient rooms. I've read the SOPs. Mercer set the tablet down. Something in his posture changed. Not a lot, but enough. She had seen that shift before in men who had decided that a situation had moved to a different category. "Take her out," he said. The younger man by the door moved toward her. What happened in the next 4 seconds was something Claire had not done in 14 months and had spent some effort trying to forget she knew how to do. She sidestepped, used his own momentum, and put him face first into the wall with his arm in a position that communicated clearly that additional movement would be painful. She held him there with approximately 20% of the force she was capable of. Enough to stop the situation, not enough to cause damage she'd have to account for later. The large man by the window had his hand inside his jacket. "Don't," Claire said. Quiet. No heat in it at all. That was important. Heat meant emotion, and emotion meant someone who could be waited out. Quiet certainty meant someone who had calculated the outcome and was not particularly interested in the argument. He stopped. Mercer stared at her. Something was moving through his expression that she recognized as the experience of recalibration. When information you thought you had turns out to be wrong in a fundamental way. "What are you?" he said. It came out with an edge of something that wasn't quite anger. It was almost curious. "I'm a nurse," she said. "Let go of whatever reason you think brought you into this room tonight, Roland. It's not going to work out the way you planned." He reached into his jacket, and from outside the room, from the corridor, from the stairwell, from more than one direction, came the sound that changed every calculation in the room simultaneously. It was the sound of multiple sets of boots, moving with coordinated precision, and over the radio on Mercer's belt came a burst of static, and then a voice she recognized. "Farrow." "Security Chief Roland Mercer, this is Captain Dennis Farrow, Naval Criminal Investigative Service. The building is currently being secured. All personnel in room 14B are instructed to remain in place." Mercer's hand came out of his jacket empty. The large man near the window stepped back from the wall. The young man Claire was holding stopped trying to get free. And Warren Tibbs, who had been sitting in his bed for 11 hours in a compromised safe house with the particular patience of a man who had no other options, let out a long breath and said very quietly, "About time." The door opened. 2 men in tactical gear came through first, then Farrow himself, older than she remembered, with more gray in the short hair above his ears, but the same economy of movement, the same expression of someone who had already processed every possible outcome of this moment before arriving in it. He looked at Claire. He looked at the young man she was holding against the wall. He looked at Mercer. Then he looked back at Claire. "You said you'd hold position," he said. "I held it until I couldn't," she said. Something in his expression shifted. Not quite approval, not exactly. Something more complicated than that. Something that had a long history behind it she didn't have time to examine right now. "Let him go," he said. "We've got him." She released the young man. He was taken by one of the tactical team members immediately, efficiently, without drama. Mercer was being placed in restraints. He was not speaking. He had the look of a man who was already calculating which card to play, which relationship to invoke, which board member's phone number to ask for. That calculus was going to take longer than he expected to produce results, but she could see him running it, because men like Roland Mercer did not stop running it, even when the outcome was no longer in question. Pharaoh crossed the room toward her and stopped 3 feet away. 4.5 hours, he said. Timeline moved up, she said. I know, we accelerated. He looked at her steadily. You knew we'd accelerated. I hoped you had. He glanced down at her hands. Not checking for injury, she understood that. Checking for something else. The old assessment habit, looking at someone he'd worked alongside in worse conditions than this, and reading what the situation had cost them. You all right? I'm fine. You sure? She thought about the parking lot at 6:30 in the evening, Roland Mercer's sidearm at his side, his smile. She thought about 14 months of choosing quiet, choosing small, choosing a life built on the deliberate decision not to be who she had been. She thought about Danny's hand, not entirely steady, holding out her access card. About Warren Tibbs saying about time with the voice of someone who had been waiting a very long time to be somewhere safer than where he was. I'm sure, she said. It wasn't entirely true, but it was true enough. Pharaoh turned back toward the door, already shifting into the next task, the next sequence, the processing that would begin now and run for hours. Then he stopped. We found the ghost badge, he said, without turning around. The secondary credential on your delivery logs. It's registered to a shell entity connected to a supply contractor out of Billings. A pause. The contractor has 7 other hospital clients across 3 states. She went still. Harlow Ridge wasn't the only channel, she said. No, Pharaoh said. He turned then, just enough to look at her over his shoulder. It was just the one where someone was paying attention to the delivery logs. He left the room. The tactical team moved efficiently around her, securing the scene, managing the occupants, doing what trained people did in the aftermath of something that had almost gone differently. Mercer was in the corridor now. She could hear his voice starting up, measured, controlled, already shifting toward the register of a man who was going to claim this had all been a misunderstanding. Claire looked at Warren Tibbs. He was sitting in his bed in the position he always assumed, door in sightline, back supported, the practiced watchfulness of someone who had been careful for a long time. He looked tired, not the temporary tired of a bad night, the deep kind. They're going to move you, she said. I know. Somewhere better. Hopefully. He looked at her. You're the nurse, the one who came in Wednesday. Yes. You went for the charge station instead of security. Yes. He was quiet for a moment. Smart. Mercer ran security, she said. It wasn't a complicated call. Tibbs studied her the way people did when they were seeing someone for the first time, having previously only seen their surface. What did you do before this, he said. Before nursing. She looked at the door. In the corridor, Mercer's measured voice had stopped. Someone had told him to be quiet, probably. Outside the window, the temperature was still below 0, and the mountains were dark shapes against a dark sky. And the access road was lit now with the headlights of the vehicles that had brought Pharaoh's team. I was in a different kind of medicine, she said. She left the room before he could ask the follow-up. The NCIS team worked through the night. She stayed in the building because Pharaoh asked her to stay, and because she understood that her statement, her 6 weeks of documentation, her account of the Wednesday incident, her direct witness testimony of Mercer in room 14B, was material to what came next. She sat in the family consultation room on the 3rd floor with a cup of coffee that had gone cold and answered questions for 2 hours from a federal investigator named Agent Torres, who had the precise, unaffected manner of someone who had conducted a great many of these conversations and was primarily interested in facts rather than impressions. She gave Torres the spiral notebook. Torres photographed every page. At 3:40 a.m., the door to the consultation room opened, and Dr. Patricia Holt came in. She was in street clothes, which meant someone had called her at home, which meant the situation had escalated to the level where administration was being notified at 4 in the morning. She looked at Claire for a long moment before she sat down. "You need to tell me," Holt said, "what I don't know." "That's a broad question." "Claire." Holt's voice had something in it that wasn't quite an apology and wasn't quite a plea. It was the sound of a woman realizing that the shape of the situation she thought she'd managed was not the actual shape of it. "Please." Claire looked at her. Dr. Patricia Holt had signed the reprimand form without much of a fight. She had used the word positioned. "You're not positioned to win this battle." And she had not been wrong, technically. She had simply been wrong about what kind of battle it was. "Mercer has been using hospital infrastructure as a distribution channel," Claire said. "After-hours deliveries, falsified receiving logs, a ghost badge credential that isn't linked to any current staff member. He's been at it for at least 4 months based on what I can document. Longer, possibly. There's a federal patient upstairs who was placed here specifically as a witness in an investigation that connects to those supply chain irregularities. And someone leaked his location, and based on the evidence I've been collecting, Mercer was that someone." Holt was quiet for a long time. "I signed your reprimand," she said. "I know. He told me you were becoming a problem. He said it was an HR matter." "I know that too." Another silence. Outside in the corridor, someone was moving equipment, the efficient sound of a building being processed by people who knew what they were doing. "The board members he has relationships with," Claire said. "Someone is going to need to look at those." Holt closed her eyes briefly. "Yes," she said. "Someone is." She left. Claire sat with the cold coffee and the empty notebook. Torres still had it, and tried to think about what came next. What came next was complicated. Mercer would lawyer up by morning. The board members with relationships to examine would generate institutional friction. The 7 other hospital clients the Billings contractor serviced meant this investigation was not going to stay in Harlow Ridge. It was going to expand in ways that would require people and time and the kind of procedural patience that Claire had always found more difficult than the operational parts. She was not going to be central to any of it. She was a witness. A suspended nurse with a deactivated badge and a reprimand in her file, who had gained access to a secure facility using a borrowed credential, and who had physically restrained a man in the course of an unsanctioned intervention in a federal operation. Farah was going to have some paperwork on that. She looked at the window. It was 4:10 a.m., and the sky was still entirely dark. And somewhere below in the parking lot, Roland Mercer was in the back of a federal vehicle, and upstairs Warren Tibbs was being transferred to a location that no one had leaked. She was sitting in a consultation room that smelled like old coffee and hand sanitizer, and she was suspended, and her notebook was in an evidence bag, and her truck was in the maintenance lot. She was also, she realized, not particularly unhappy. That surprised her. She was thinking about that, the specific quality of being in a bad situation and not minding it the way she probably should, the way it felt more like returning to a familiar temperature than falling into difficulty. When Torres came back into the room and sat down across from her with a new folder. "One more thing," Torres said. "The ghost badge credential. We ran the entity registration." "And?" Torres opened the folder and set a photograph on the table between them. It was a surveillance image, low resolution, timestamp in the corner. 6 weeks ago, the hospital receiving bay, after hours. 2 figures. One she recognized as Mercer. The other was turned mostly away from the camera, but not entirely. She looked at the face. She knew it. Not from Harlow Ridge. Not from Montana. From somewhere earlier. Somewhere that should have been entirely disconnected from this building and this investigation and this specific situation. And the recognition hit her with the particular cold weight of something that changed the size of what she was dealing with. "Do you know this person?" Torres said. Claire looked at the photograph for 3 more seconds. "Yes," she said. "I know exactly who that is." The name in the photograph was Victor Slade. She had not seen him in 4 years. She had not expected to see him again, not because she believed people like Victor Slade disappeared. She knew better than that. but because the last time she had seen him, he had been escorted out of a Naval Special Warfare Command building in Coronado with a permanent access revocation and a federal contractor debarment that was supposed to have closed every institutional door available to him. Supposed to have. Torres was watching her face. "You want to tell me where you know him from?" Torres said. It wasn't quite a question. He was a logistics contractor, Naval Special Warfare Command, Coronado. He managed supply chain for forward-deployed medical units. She paused. He was terminated 4 years ago after an internal audit flagged irregular procurement documentation. It didn't go to prosecution. The case had evidentiary issues. He was debarred from federal contracting and the file was closed. Torres wrote something. Evidentiary issues. The audit was thorough. The prosecution case wasn't. She looked at the photograph again. He had people who helped him with the documentation. Good ones. Whoever built his paper trail the first time knew what they were doing. And the second time? She thought about the delivery logs. The ghost badge. 9 incidents over 4 months, each one time-stamped with a precision that suggested someone who understood institutional documentation, who knew which records were audited routinely and which ones sat in a system that nobody pulled unless they had a specific reason. Less careful, she said, or more confident. Sometimes those look the same. Torres closed the folder. Commander Voss. Whitmore, she said, and then stopped, because Torres had used the other name deliberately, and they both knew it. She looked at him. How long have you known? Since about an hour after Pharaoh called in the team deployment. Torres's voice was entirely even. Your service record is classified at a level that made verification slow, but not impossible. We needed to understand who we had in the building. He paused. You want to know why I didn't say anything sooner? I want to know what it changes. Torres looked at her steadily. Nothing tonight. You're still a witness. Your documentation is still material evidence. What it changes is the scope of what we're going to need from you going forward, because Victor Slade with a live operation running through a veterans medical center isn't an isolated fraud case. It's a network, and you're one of the few people with direct prior knowledge of how he builds one. She sat back in the chair. The consultation room was very quiet. Down the hall, she could hear the low-frequency sound of the building being processed. Movement, equipment, the occasional radio burst. But in here, it was just Torres and the cold coffee and the folder with Victor Slade's face. He knew I was here, she said. Torres looked at her. The 2 men Wednesday night. They came in, saw me, left. She was running it backward now, the sequence she hadn't fully examined yet because there had been too much else happening. They didn't come back the same night. They waited 2 days. By Thursday morning, I was suspended. By Friday afternoon, I was out of the building. She met Torres's eyes. That's not Mercer's timeline. Mercer's been building the reprimand case for 6 weeks, since I started looking at the delivery logs. But the suspension happened 2 days after those men saw me in Tibbs's room. Victor Slade saw my face in that doorway and recognized me, and he told Mercer to move faster. Torres was quiet for a moment. That's a significant claim. It's a logical one. She pushed the folder back toward him. Slade knows my background. He knew what it meant that I was in that building, in that room, at that hour. He knew I wasn't going to let it go. She paused. He tried to get me out before I could do what I just did. Torres picked up the folder. He looked at it for a moment and then set it down again. He didn't succeed. No, she said. He didn't. Torres stood. Get some sleep if you can. I'm going to need a formal recorded statement at 0900, and after that I'm going to need you available for a briefing with the senior case agent. He moved toward the door, then stopped. The notebook. I'll make sure it's logged as your property. You'll get it back when the evidentiary process allows. She nodded. He left. She sat in the consultation room alone for a while. The cold coffee. The window with the dark sky beginning, barely, to gray at the bottom edge. 4 in the morning in Harlow Ridge, Montana, and Victor Slade's face in a surveillance photograph. She had not thought about Slade in 2 years. Before that, she had thought about him in the specific way you thought about unfinished things. Not obsessively, not with particular anger, but with the persistent low-level awareness of someone who knew that a case marked closed was not always a case that was finished. The debarment had satisfied the institution. It had not satisfied the logic of what he was. Men like Victor Slade did not stop. They relocated. They rebuilt their paper trails with the lessons learned from the first time, found new institutional channels, new contacts who needed what he offered, access, supply, the bureaucratic infrastructure that made moving things look like it was supposed to be happening. He had found Mercer, or Mercer had found him. Either way, they had found Harlow Ridge, and they had found Warren Tibbs, and they had almost found a way to close both problems at once. Almost. She closed her eyes and stayed very still, and did the things she had learned to do in field positions when sleep wasn't possible, but the body needed something. A controlled stillness, not quite rest, that let the nervous system process without shutting down. 20 minutes of it. When she opened her eyes, the window was lighter by a degree, and she felt marginally more prepared for what the next several hours were going to require. The 0900 statement took 90 minutes. The briefing with the senior case agent took longer. His name was Special Agent David Kwan, and he ran the NCIS field office out of Great Falls. And he had the particular quality of someone who had been doing serious federal work long enough that he no longer felt the need to perform authority. It was simply present in the room with him the way temperature was. You noticed it without being told to. He had a copy of her service record, which meant someone above Torres's pay grade had authorized the pull, which meant this had escalated overnight in ways she hadn't fully tracked. "Commander Voss," he said. "I'm not—" She stopped. There was apparently a point past which correcting the name was no longer the battle worth fighting. "Whitmore." Juan looked at her over his coffee. "We're going to need to talk about Victor Slade." "Torres told me." "Torres gave you the opening. I need the rest." He settled back. "Everything you know about how he operates, how he builds the procurement structure, how he recruits the internal contacts, what the red flags look like before the audit trail becomes visible. The 7 other hospital clients we've identified are going to generate 7 other investigations, and the people running those investigations don't have what you have. Direct experience. Direct experience." She talked for an hour and 40 minutes. She was thorough. She had a detailed memory for operational specifics, dates, structures, methods, and she laid out everything she knew about Slade's methodology from the Coronado case with the same precision she'd brought to 14 weeks of delivery log documentation. Kwan listened without interrupting. He took notes. Twice he stopped her to have something repeated for the recording. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "He's still out there," she said. "We're working on location. He wasn't in that parking lot last night. He doesn't position himself where the exposure is. He positions his contacts there. The Billings entity is a shell, which means there's a primary somewhere else." She paused. "He'll know by now that Mercer's been taken. He'll move the primary. We know that. How quickly can you—" "We're working on it," Kwan said, and there was a firmness in it that meant this is the limit of what I'm sharing with a civilian witness. And she recognized the boundary and stopped. She was not in the operation. She was adjacent to it. That was the correct position, and she knew it. And she also knew the way you knew things about yourself that you didn't particularly enjoy knowing, that being adjacent to it was harder than being in it. She left the briefing at 11:20 a.m. The hospital was different in daylight. The NCIS presence had shifted from tactical to investigative, the kind of careful, methodical evidence processing that looked like people carrying boxes and taking photographs and speaking in low voices. The nursing staff moved around it with the particular adaptive efficiency of medical personnel in disrupted environments, because patients still needed care regardless of what the federal government was doing in the administrative wing. Danny found her in the corridor outside the family consultation room. "You're still here," Danny said. She looked like she hadn't slept either. "Giving statements," Claire said. "You should go home. Your shift ended 3 hours ago, I know." Danny stood there with her arms crossed, not in defensiveness, in the posture of someone who was cold and tired and had decided to wait for something. "Is it true? About Mercer? What are you hearing?" "That federal agents arrested him last night. That there were men in a patient's room." Danny's eyes were direct. "That you were involved." "I was in the building." "Claire." She looked at Danny, 24 years old, 8 months into her first real hospital job. A woman who had been taking a longer hallway for weeks to avoid a man who used his position the way Roland Mercer used his position. Who had handed over her access card with an unsteady hand because someone she trusted had asked her to. "It's true," Claire said. "He's been arrested. There's a federal investigation." She paused. You didn't do anything wrong. The access card, you gave it to me as a private individual, not as part of your duties. That's not a disciplinary issue. That's not what I was worried about. Danny uncrossed her arms. I was worried about you. Claire didn't have an immediate response to that. It was a different kind of disarming than tactical. The simple, direct concern of someone who had been paying attention in a different way than federal investigators. I'm fine, she said. Go home, Danny. Danny went. Dr. Holt found her 20 minutes later and told her she needed to come to the administrative wing. Not a request, but then it looked. The administrative wing had 4 people in it. Besides Holt, 2 board members she recognized by face but not by name, a hospital attorney who was not on speakerphone this time, but physically present and visibly unhappy about it, and Lawrence Dunn, the hospital director, who had the specific expression of a man who was trying to determine which version of events was going to cause him the least institutional damage. They sat at the conference table. Claire sat across from them. Given the circumstances of last night, Dunn began. Lawrence, one of the board members said, a woman, older, with close-cropped gray hair and the kind of posture that suggested she had not gotten where she was by letting other people run conversations. Her nameplate said Carolyn Webb, board chair. I'll take this. She looked at Claire. Ms. Whitmore, you were suspended yesterday afternoon. Correct. Based on complaints filed by Roland Mercer, who was arrested last night by federal agents in connection with a criminal investigation centered on this facility. That's my understanding, yes. Webb looked at her for a moment with the directness of someone who had spent decades evaluating people across tables. The board is rescinding the suspension, effective this morning. Your file will be cleared of the reprimand and the related documentation. HR will contact you regarding reinstatement and back pay for the period of the suspension. The attorney made a note. Dunn looked like he was trying to decide whether to say something and deciding against it. Thank you, Claire said. Don't thank me yet. Webb leaned forward slightly. I have questions. Not for the record, not for the investigation. Kwan's team has what they need from us for now. I have questions as board chair because this institution is going to be in the news by this evening, and I need to understand the shape of what happened here. She paused. Who are you, Ms. Whitmore? The actual answer. Claire looked at her. Carolyn Webb had been board chair of Harlow Ridge Veterans Medical Center for, she guessed, at least a decade, based on the way she carried institutional authority, the way she'd taken the conversation from Dunn without friction. She had not been implicated in anything Mercer had done. She was asking a direct question, and she wanted a direct answer. My name is Claire Whitmore, she said. I'm a nurse. Before that, I was a Navy SEAL medical officer. Commander, Naval Special Warfare Command. She kept her voice level. I came to Harlow Ridge because veterans medicine matters to me, and because I wanted to do something quieter than what I'd been doing. That's the actual answer. Webb was quiet for a moment. And the investigation, the documentation you provided. I noticed the delivery logs didn't add up. I kept records. It's what I do when something doesn't add up. For 14 weeks. Yes. Webb looked at her for a long moment. Then she looked at Dunn, and then at the attorney, and something in her expression suggested she was doing the same kind of recalibrating that Mercer had briefly done in room 14B. Updating a picture of a situation based on information that changed its shape. We'll expect you back on shift, Webb said, when you're ready. Take the time you need. The meeting ended. Claire left the administrative wing and found a chair in the corridor outside the east stairwell and sat in it because her legs were doing the thing they sometimes did after extended high adrenaline periods. Not weakness, just the body's accounting, presenting its bill. She sat and breathed and let the building move around her. She should have felt better than she did. The suspension was rescinded. Mercer was in federal custody. Torres had the documentation. Tibbs was somewhere safer. The institutional machinery of Harlow Ridge was beginning to process what had happened, which was a slow and imperfect process, but a real one. What she couldn't stop thinking about was Victor Slade. She had told Kwan everything she knew about his methodology. She had given him the Coronado file context, the procurement structure, the red flags. And Kwan had said, we're working on location in the tone of someone who knew less than they wanted to and was not going to admit it. Slade had known she was at Harlow Ridge. He had recognized her face through a closed door on a Wednesday night and begun moving to remove her within 48 hours, which meant he had been monitoring his exposure carefully enough to recognize a threat that no one else in the building had recognized, which meant his operational security was better than the Coronado case had suggested. Better. Or he had learned from Coronado. From the audit that should have been a prosecution but wasn't. She pulled out her phone. The encrypted channel was still open. She typed to Pharaoh. Slade knows the operation is blown. What's his exposure point? Does he know about the logs or just that Mercer was taken? Pharaoh's response took 6 minutes. Unknown. Assume he knows both. She typed, then he's not running. He's repositioning. He has active clients he can't abandon. Too much at stake financially. He's moving the primary entity, not closing it. A longer pause this time. Then, Kwan's team is tracking the Billings entity dissolution. If he moves assets, she typed, he won't move assets through the entity. He'll burn it. The assets are already somewhere else. She stared at the phone. Pharaoh didn't respond immediately, which meant he was taking it somewhere, showing it to someone, or both. The hallway was quiet. The morning shift was in full operation on the patient floors. She could hear the distant rhythm of a normal hospital day. The announcements, the rolling carts, the particular acoustic quality of a building that was doing its actual work, regardless of what the federal investigators were doing in the administrative wing. She needed to sleep. She had been awake for, she checked the time, it was 12:40 p.m., approximately 29 hours. She had given 2 formal statements, been reinstated, and spent the last hour running the logic of Victor Slade's next move on a hospital hallway chair. Her phone buzzed. Pharaoh. Kwan wants you in the briefing room, now. She stood. Her legs were fine. She went. The briefing room was on the 2nd floor, a space that had been commandeered overnight. Evidence boards on 2 walls now, a secure laptop set up on the central table, Torres and 2 agents she hadn't met positioned around it. Kwan was standing when she came in, which told her the situation had changed since the morning. Sit down, Kwan said. Not unkind, urgent. She sat. We have a problem, he said. The Billings entity. We flagged it for dissolution monitoring this morning. At 11:47 a.m., someone initiated a transfer of the entity's operating documentation to a new filing address in Wyoming. He turned the laptop to face her. On the screen was a document filing, dry, bureaucratic, the kind of thing that was publicly accessible and deeply boring unless you knew what you were looking at. The Wyoming address is a mail drop. We're running it now. But the entity transfer was authorized with a digital signature that traces to a credential issued under a name we didn't have before. He turned to the evidence board. There was a new photograph there, different from the surveillance image Torres had shown her in the early morning. This one was clearer. A man, 60s, silver-haired, standing outside a building she recognized. She recognized the building because she had worked in it for 4 years. It was the Naval Medical Center in Portsmouth, Virginia. We don't have a name on this credential yet, Kwan said. But the photograph was taken 8 months ago, outside Portsmouth Naval Medical Center. We're asking because you were based there. I know him, Claire said. Her voice came out flat. Entirely flat, the way it went when something surprised her so completely that the processing wasn't finished yet. You know, his name is Gerald Forsyth. I was a civilian administrator at Portsmouth. Medical supply chain oversight. She looked at Kwan. I was my direct civilian counterpart on 2 joint procurement reviews. He had full access to... She stopped. To what? Kwan said. To every forward deployed medical unit's supply chain documentation. Every unit I was attached to, for 4 years. The stillness she was sitting in was a different kind than the controlled stillness of the early morning. This one had a cold quality. The particular cold of realizing that a threat had been present in a place where you had believed yourself to be protected. He would know my background, my real background, everything. If Forsyth and Slade are connected, they're not just connected, she said. Forsyth is how Slade rebuilt after Coronado. He needed someone inside a legitimate medical institutional framework who could reconstruct the supply chain documentation. Forsyth was at Portsmouth. He had access and he had legitimacy. She looked at the photograph on the board, at the familiar building behind the silver-haired man she had worked alongside for 4 years, whose quarterly reviews she had signed off on. Slade didn't just know I was here, Forsyth told him. Forsyth knew where I went when I left the service. The room was quiet for a moment. Then Kwan's phone rang. He looked at it. Something in his expression changed, a tightening, fast and controlled. He stepped away from the table. Torres looked at Claire. His face had the expression of someone who was deciding how much to say. "What?" she said. "Forsyth," Torres said. "We issued a locate request this morning after we ran the Portsmouth photograph. His phone last pinged." He checked his notes. "A cell tower 14 miles from Harlow Ridge, at 6:15 this morning." She was out of the chair before she decided to stand. "He's not running," she said. "He's here." Kwan came back to the table. His phone was still in his hand. "We just got confirmation from local dispatch. A vehicle matching the description of Forsyth's registered rental was spotted on the Harlow Ridge access road 20 minutes ago." He looked at her directly. "The hospital is being locked down." "He's coming for the documentation," Claire said. "The physical logs, the receiving bay records. If what I pulled from the records room last night isn't enough to reconstruct the chain, the physical originals are in the administrative storage vault," Torres finished. "We know. We've got people there." "How many?" A pause that was a fraction too long. "How many people?" she said again. "2 agents in the administrative wing," Kwan said. "The rest of the team is staged at the primary access point." "The primary access point is the front entrance," she said. "The receiving bay is at the east end of the building. The same east end where the service entrance is. The same entrance that had a camera blind spot and a laundry service door." She looked at him. "The same entrance I used at 9:22 last night with a borrowed badge." Kwan was already reaching for his radio. And from somewhere below them, below and east, in the direction of the east wing, came the sound of an alarm. Not the patient alarm that meant a medical emergency. Not the code tones she knew by sound from 14 months of night shifts. The building's external access alert. A door forced. Kwan raised the radio. "All units, east service entrance, now." Claire was already moving toward the door. "Whitmore," Kwan said sharply. She stopped, turned. "You're a witness," he said. "You stay here." She looked at him. She looked at the evidence board with Gerald Forsyth's face and the building she had worked in for 4 years behind him. She looked at Torres, who had the expression of someone who already knew which way this was going. "The receiving bay," she said, "has 3 interior access points. The main corridor, the freight elevator, and a service passage behind the laundry room that's not on the standard building schematic. It was added during the 2019 East Wing renovation. It's not in the access log system because it doesn't have an electronic lock." She paused. "Your agents don't know about it. I do." Kwan held her gaze for 3 full seconds. "You stay behind the team," he said. "You do not engage. You are a guide, not an operator. The moment I say stop, you stop." "Understood." She turned and went through the door and down the stairwell, and behind her she could hear Kwan's radio traffic, and ahead of her the East Wing corridor was already different. The particular altered quality of a building that knew something was wrong. The nursing staff pulling back from the corridor, a charge nurse holding a phone, 2 patients standing confused in a doorway. She moved through it fast and quiet, the way she moved when it mattered. The service passage behind the laundry room was 60 feet ahead. Gerald Forsyth had 4 minutes on her, maybe 5. In her 14 years of doing this in one form or another, 4 minutes had sometimes been enough, and sometimes it hadn't. The service passage was exactly where she remembered it, behind the 3rd laundry cart rack, a door that wasn't marked because it had been added as a contractor access point during the renovation and never formally incorporated into the building directory. She had found it in month 3 during a slow night shift when she had been doing what she always did in new environments, walking the geometry until she understood it completely. She went through it fast. The passage was narrow, concrete block, fluorescent lighting that buzzed on a motion sensor and took 2 seconds to come up. 2 seconds of moving in the dark before the light caught up. The air smelled like detergent and cold concrete, and the particular industrial damp of a space that nobody used enough to warm. Behind her she could hear boots, Kwan's team moving through the main corridor, their radio traffic muffled by the walls. Ahead of her the passage ran 40 feet and opened into the back section of the receiving bay, behind the loading dock shelving. She slowed before the end, sounds carried in concrete passages. She stopped 3 feet from the opening and listened, and what she heard told her she was not the first one there. Movement. Deliberate, not panicked. Someone working. The specific sound of a filing drawer pulled open, the friction of folders being moved quickly. and under that, quieter, the faint electronic chirp of a device, a phone, or more likely, a portable scanner, the kind used for bulk document capture. She moved to the edge of the opening and looked. Gerald Forsyth was at the far end of the receiving bay, at the records cabinet she had photographed 6 weeks ago and never been able to access directly. I was exactly as she remembered him from Portsmouth, silver-haired, 60s, the build of a man who had spent his career at desks but kept himself in reasonable condition. He wore civilian clothes, nothing that would stand out in a hospital setting. He had a small scanning device in one hand and a folder in the other, and he was moving with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done this before, which he had, in a different building with different records and a different institutional framework. She counted. One exit behind her, one exit to her left. The main corridor door, currently closed. The loading dock door to Forsyth's right was the one that had triggered the alarm, which meant it was open, which meant he had an exit planned, and it wasn't through the building. She looked at the gap between her position and Forsyth. 30 feet. Open floor, metal shelving units on either side. No cover worth mentioning. She stepped out of the passage. "Gerald," she said. He turned. The recognition was instantaneous. She saw it move through his face in the specific way recognition moved through the faces of people who were hoping not to be recognized. His hands didn't stop moving for a full second. The autonomic continuation of a task interrupted mid-execution, and then he registered the situation and went still. "Claire," he said. He sounded almost resigned. Almost. "Put the scanner down." He looked at it in his hand. Then he looked past her, toward the passage opening, then toward the main corridor door. "Federal agents are in this building," she said. "The loading dock exit is already flagged. You have nowhere to go through, and the only question is whether this ends here quietly, or—" "I'm not carrying a weapon," he said. "I know." She did know. She had assessed him the moment she saw him, the posture, the weight distribution, the absence of the particular tension that came with someone who was armed and considering using it. Forsyth was many things. He was not that. "Put the scanner on the shelf." He set it down. He kept the folder. "The folder too," she said. He looked at it. For a moment she thought he was going to run for the dock door, and she recalculated the distance and the angles and prepared for it. But something in his expression shifted, and he set the folder on the shelf beside the scanner. She crossed the floor toward him. 20 feet, 15. He watched her come, and she watched his face, and she thought about 4 years of quarterly supply chain reviews at Portsmouth, 4 years of professional courtesy and institutional proximity, 4 years of trusting a paper trail because she had never had a reason not to. "How long?" she said. He looked at the floor briefly. "Slade approached me 2 years before you left Portsmouth." 6 years. 6 years before she had ever walked into Harlow Ridge Veterans Medical Center, before she had driven up from Billings with a truck that needed a new alternator and 2 duffel bags. Gerald Forsyth had already been building the second version of the network that had almost cost Warren Tibbs his life. "The Coronado case," she said. "You helped him with the documentation the first time." He didn't answer immediately. She took that as a yes. "You were in the evidentiary gap," she said. "The audit had the procurement irregularities. The prosecution couldn't trace the paper trail because you built it clean." She stopped 6 feet from him. "And then when it fell apart anyway, you rebuilt it from Portsmouth. It's more complicated than—" "Is it?" She looked at him. "Which part?" He looked older than she remembered. Not the silver hair. That had been silver at Portsmouth too. Something else. The particular aging of someone who had been maintaining a version of themselves that required significant effort and had just stopped. "He had documentation on me from the first audit," Forsyth said. "Things that didn't make it into the public record. He's held it for 6 years. So it started as coercion." "It started as coercion." He paused. "It became something else over time. That's the honest answer." "Because you got paid." He didn't argue with that. The main corridor door opened. 2 NCIS agents came through fast, and behind them Torres, and Forsyth turned at the sound, and the moment he turned, whatever remained of the calculating part of him, the part that had been running options even during this conversation, appeared to conclude its calculation and come up empty. He put his hands up. Not dramatically, just raised them. A man conceding a situation that had run out of exits. Torres crossed the room and took the scanner from the shelf without touching the folder. He looked at Claire. "You said guide," he said. He was already here when I arrived, she said. I contained the situation. Torres looked at Forsyth. He looked at Claire. He made the expression of someone who was deciding not to have a particular conversation right now and flagging it for later. Forsyth was put in restraints by the two agents. Efficiently, without roughness. He wasn't resisting, and the agents were professionals. He looked at Claire once more before they moved him toward the corridor. You were good at the reviews, he said. You caught things other people missed. That's why Slade wanted you out of the building. I know, she said. I want you to know that I argued against the Tibbs arrangement, for whatever that's worth. She looked at him. A man almost died in room 14B last night, Gerald. Whatever you argued for doesn't weigh much against what you helped build. He had nothing to say to that. They took him out. The loading dock door was secured by 1 p.m. The NCIS team processed the receiving bay for the next 3 hours. Photographs, evidence bags, the physical records Forsyth had been attempting to scan. The folder he'd set on the shelf turned out to contain 4 months of original receiving documentation, the physical counterpart to the digital logs Claire had been tracking. When Torres showed her the folder's contents in an evidence bag, she looked at the timestamps and said quietly, He was going to burn the originals. Presumably, Torres said, leaving only the falsified digital version, which would have been clean enough to withstand a basic audit, except you had the comparison data. She thought about the spiral notebook, 14 weeks of handwritten timestamps and cross-reference discrepancies, carried in a coat pocket because she had a habit of documentation that was too deep to switch off. 14 weeks, she said. Torres looked at her with something that was not quite sympathy, but was adjacent to it. The expression of someone who understood what it meant to be right about a thing for a long time before anyone would listen. The notebook is going to be significant in the prosecution, he said. All 3 of them. 3. Mercer, Forsyth, and Slade. Except Slade was not yet in custody, and she was aware of that the way she was aware of a sound she couldn't locate. It was there. She just couldn't see it yet. She went back to the consultation room on the 3rd floor. She called Farrow. Forsyth is in custody, she said when he picked up. I know, Quan briefed me. A pause. You went into the receiving bay. I guided the team to an access point, and then you were in the bay when Forsyth was there. That's accurate. Claire. He said it the way he'd said it in the parking lot call. Actual first name, the one that meant he was speaking to a person rather than managing an operational contact. You've been awake for over 30 hours. 31, she said. Slade. We're working on it. Farrow. Where is he? A pause that had the texture of someone weighing what to share. The Wyoming mail drop has been traced to a business address in Casper. The business address is connected to a property lease. The property lease has a name on it that traces to a third-party entity, which we are currently... Farrow. We don't have him yet, he said. We have the structure. We're moving through it. She thought about what she'd told Quan that morning. He's not running. He's repositioning. Victor Slade had been building and rebuilding the same network for the better part of a decade, with different institutional channels each time, with new contacts recruited from the specific population of people who had access and vulnerability. He was patient. He was methodical. He had watched the Coronado case collapse and had spent 6 years building something more robust. He also knew that Mercer and Forsyth were in custody. He knew his physical records had been secured. He knew the network was exposed. What would a patient, methodical man do? He has another contact, she said. What? Mercer was the hospital access. Forsyth was the documentation infrastructure. Slade doesn't build a 2-person network. There's always a redundancy. Someone else who doesn't know about the others, who can be activated separately. She was on her feet without realizing she'd stood. The 7 other hospital clients. What do we know about the internal contacts at those facilities? Quan's team is, what do we know right now? The pause was longer this time, she heard typing. 3 of the 7 have identified internal contacts based on the delivery log pattern analysis, Farrow said. 1 is a supply chain manager in Idaho. 1 is a pharmacy director in Colorado. 1 is... He stopped. She waited. 1 is listed as a security administrator in Nevada, he said. Nevada facility is Renton Bridge Veterans Medical Center. Security administrator name is... Another pause. Listed as K. Pratt. The name landed like a stone dropped into cold water. She stood absolutely still. Pratt, the young officer who had stood 6 feet away in the hospital parking lot on Friday evening with the awkward expression of someone brought along for a purpose he wasn't certain about, while Roland Mercer held a sidearm at his side and told her she was done. Pratt, who had been a witness to what Mercer had done. Pratt, who had looked uncomfortable enough that she had used his presence as a leverage point. Pratt, who had been in that parking lot because Mercer had brought him, and who had left with Mercer, and who had presumably given a statement to Torres's team. She had not tracked whether his statement had been taken. She had been focused on other things. "What facility is Pratt currently associated with?" she said. "Harlow Ridge or Renton Bridge?" More typing. Then, "Farrow. Quan's team ran Pratt yesterday evening. He's listed as an officer at Harlow Ridge. Clean record, 2 years employment. He was in the parking lot Friday night. He was with Mercer. He gave a statement. He confirmed the weapon was drawn. His statement was cooperative. Where is he now?" A long pause. Typing. Then a pause that was different. The specific quality of a pause, when someone on the other end has just found something they were not expecting. "Farrow," she said. "His shift started at 0700, Farrow said slowly. "He signed in. The security log shows him badging through 3 separate interior access points between 0700 and 0830. Another pause. "He hasn't badged through anything since 0831. It was currently 2:47 p.m. "He's in this building," she said. "Off-grid. No badge access since 0831, which means he's either in a location that doesn't require a badge scan, or he's using someone else's credential. Or he left through an unmonitored exit. He knows this building," she said. "He's worked here 2 years. If Slade needed someone to be in place after Mercer was taken, someone the NCIS team wouldn't look at immediately because his statement was cooperative, Pratt is positioned exactly right." She was already moving toward the door. "Claire," Farrow said, "do not." "I'm going to tell Quan," she said. "I'm not doing anything else." She stopped with her hand on the door. "But Farrow, Quan's team has been processing the receiving bay for 3 hours. If Pratt needed to be somewhere in this building without being noticed, where would he go while the federal presence was concentrated on the East Wing?" She heard Farrow start to answer and then stop. The same thought was completing itself in her head. The administrative storage vault. Webb had told her the board was going to examine Mercer's relationships with the board members. That examination would start with the institutional financial records, the original contract documentation, the board meeting minutes, anything that showed the approval chain for the supply arrangements. Those records lived in the administrative vault on the first floor, the vault that 2 NCIS agents had been assigned to that morning before the East Wing alarm had pulled focus, before Forsyth had come in through the loading dock door, before 3 hours of evidence processing had absorbed the team's attention and logistics. "How many people are still in the administrative vault?" she said. Typing. Silence. "Farrow." "1," he said. "1 agent. The second was reassigned to the receiving bay at 1:15 p.m. She came out of the consultation room at a pace that was controlled enough to not alarm the nursing staff and fast enough that she covered the length of the south corridor in 40 seconds. She took the stairwell 2 steps at a time going down. First floor. Administrative wing. The corridor was empty. The NCIS presence here had thinned as the team's activity concentrated on the East Wing processing, and the remaining hospital administrative staff had been sent home early pending the investigation. There was a specific quiet in the corridor, not normal hospital quiet, which had texture and ambient sound, but the particular quiet of a space that was missing people who should be in it. She was 10 feet from the vault door when she heard it. A sound she should not have been able to hear through a solid door, which meant the door was not entirely closed. A voice. Low, male, with the specific cadence of someone working under pressure. And under it, another sound, something that might have been a phone or a scanner device being used. And then a third sound, which she identified immediately and which changed every calculation. A sharp exhalation, the involuntary sound of someone who had just been hurt, followed by the specific quality of silence that followed it. There was someone in that vault, 2 people. One of them Pratt, one of them the NCIS agent who had been assigned there. And the silence after that sound was the kind that meant the agent was no longer a factor in what was happening in the room. She pushed the vault door open. The NCIS agent, young, she didn't know his name, was on the floor against the far wall, conscious but dazed. the specific look of someone who had taken a blow to the head and was working on whether they were going to stay upright. Blood from a cut above his eyebrow, not serious but generating the particular drama that head wounds did. His sidearm was not in its holster, it was in Pratt's right hand. Pratt was at the central records table. On the table was a phone with its camera app open. He had been photographing documents, a stack of them, and he had gotten far enough through the stack that he had compromised material already. He was young. She had registered that in the parking lot, young and uncertain. But he was holding the weapon with the steadiness of someone who had been trained with it, which made him more dangerous than someone who was simply afraid. He turned when she came through the door and brought the weapon up. She stopped. "Close the door," he said. She reached back and pushed it. It clicked shut behind her. "Pratt," she said. "I know who you are," he said. His voice was controlled in the way that very young men controlled their voices when they were trying not to show they were frightened. "Mercer told me about you." "What did he tell you?" "That you were trouble, that you'd been investigating." He was right about both things. She kept her hands visible, relaxed, not raised. Raising them would have told him she was afraid, and she was not going to tell him that. "The man on the floor needs medical attention. He's losing blood, and he may have a concussion." Pratt glanced at the agent. The glance told her something. He was not comfortable with the agent on the floor, which meant he was not someone who had intended violence. He had done it reactively, and the reality of it was sitting with him in a way he hadn't anticipated. "I need 5 more minutes," he said, "for the documents. I need to send these to Slade." The name moved through his face, a flicker of something. "You don't know. Victor Slade," she said. "You've been a contact for approximately 2 years. Initially recruited as a redundancy in the Harlow Ridge operation, probably through Mercer, probably framed as a simple favor, a lookout role, nothing that felt like what it actually was." She watched him. "And then it became something else. That's how it works with Slade. He starts with small things, and the small things accumulate until you're standing in a federal evidence vault with a weapon you didn't intend to use." Pratt's hand tightened on the weapon. Not a training tighten, an emotional one, which was different and harder to predict. "He told me it was all administrative," Pratt said, "moving supplies to facilities that couldn't get proper allocation through official channels, veterans facilities that were underfunded. He said the government system was failing them, and this was a workaround." "That's what he tells people," she said quietly. "He's very good at it." "You don't know that it wasn't. The compounds he's been moving aren't going to underfunded veteran facilities," she said. "They're going to secondary distribution channels that sell them at civilian market prices. The money doesn't go to veterans. It goes to Slade, and to the people who help him, and to Gerald Forsyth, who is currently in federal custody in this building." She paused. "The story he told you was a recruitment story. It's the same story he's told at 7 different facilities across 3 states." The weapon dropped, fractionally, not lowered, but his arm lost some of the rigid purposefulness it had been holding. The documents on the table had his fingerprints on them now. The phone had his camera activity logged. The NCIS agent on the floor had seen his face. There was no version of the next 5 minutes in which Kevin Pratt photographed those documents and sent them to Victor Slade and walked out of this hospital into anything other than a federal arrest warrant. She thought he was beginning to understand that. "Put the weapon on the table," she said. "Not on the floor. On the table. Then step back. The agent needs medical attention and I need to call for it, and I need you to not make this harder than it already is." He was 26, maybe 27. She had assessed that in the parking lot on Friday night, the same night she had used his presence as a leverage point against Mercer, the same night she had gotten in her truck and driven to the shoulder of the highway to let her heart rate come down. The weapon went onto the table. He stepped back. She moved immediately to the agent on the floor and checked him. Concussion likely, the scalp laceration was bleeding freely, but nothing arterial. He was oriented to place, though his responses were slow. She pressed her hand against the cut and looked up at Pratt. "What's the emergency extension in this building?" she said. It was not a test. She knew the extension. It was something to give him to do. He told her. She called it on her own phone with her free hand and said calmly, "I need a medical team to the administrative vault, 1st floor. 1 person down with a head injury. I also need Quan or Torres, right now." She ended the call and looked at Pratt, who was standing against the record shelf with his arms at his sides, and the expression of someone watching a version of their life close behind them. "I didn't know what it was," he said. "Not at the start." "When did you know?" He looked at the agent on the floor. "Wednesday night," he said. "When I saw those men come out of room 14B. She had been in room 14B on Wednesday night. She had been the reason those men came out. She thought about Pratt in the parking lot on Friday, his uncertain expression, the awkward posture of someone brought along for a purpose he wasn't sure about. He had known by then. He had known for 2 days, and he had stood in a hospital parking lot while his supervisor pointed a sidearm at a nurse, and he had not said anything. "Why didn't you say something to Torres?" she said. The question sat between them for a moment. "Mercer said if I talked, Slade would—" He stopped, started again. He said Slade had documentation, things I'd done, things that would— He stopped again. "The same documentation he held over Forsyth," she said, "for 6 years. Pratt looked at his hands. "Yeah." The door opened. 2 nurses came in first. She gave them the agent's status quickly, efficiently, and they moved into position. Torres came through the door 30 seconds later, took in the weapon on the table, Pratt against the shelf. Claire with her hand on the agent's scalp wound, and went still for a single beat before his training reasserted itself. "Weapon is secured on the table," Claire said. "He put it there voluntarily. The agent needs a hospital, probably 24 hours of observation." She met Torres's eyes. "Pratt has information about Victor Slade's documentation practices. He's been a contact in the network for approximately 2 years. He's willing to talk." Torres looked at Pratt. "You willing to talk?" Torres said. Pratt looked at Claire. She gave him nothing. Not encouragement, not pressure. This was his decision, and she was not going to make it for him. "Yes," Pratt said. Torres nodded. He took a pair of restraints from his jacket. "It'll go better for you if everything you just said to her is true." He glanced at Claire. "Quan wants you upstairs." She stepped back from the agent as the nurses took full control of the wound. She looked at her hand, blood, the agent's, on her palm and fingers. She looked at the documents on the table, Pratt's phone, the vault's shelving of institutional records that had almost gone the same way as the delivery logs. Almost. Torres was moving Pratt toward the door. At the threshold, Pratt turned and looked at her one more time, and she thought he was going to say something, an explanation, or an apology, or something in between. But he didn't. He just looked at her in the way people looked at someone they had needed to exist and had not, until now, understood that they needed. She went upstairs to Quan. Quan's briefing was short and consequential. The Wyoming entity dissolution had generated a financial transfer that Torres's forensic team had traced through a series of intermediary accounts to a primary operating account in a name she didn't recognize, a name, Quan told her, that connected to a lease on a property in western Montana, outside a town called Grover Creek, 40 miles from Harlow Ridge. Victor Slade was 40 miles away. He had not run. She had been right about that. "We're coordinating with the field office," Quan said. "We have a team positioning to the Grover Creek property now. We're not moving on it until the team is in place and we have the warrant confirmed." He looked at her. "I'm telling you this because your prior intelligence has been accurate at every point in this investigation, and because you are going to stay in this building while we handle it." "I understand," she said. "Do you?" "I understand," she said again, and she meant it, and he appeared to believe her because he nodded and went back to the operational coordination. She sat in the briefing room. The evidence boards had expanded since the morning. Photographs, connection diagrams. The accumulating architecture of a network that had taken 6 years to build and less than 24 hours to begin collapsing. Mercer's face was there. Forsyth's. Pratt's now, probably, somewhere in Torres's notes. And at the center, the surveillance image that Torres had shown her at 4 in the morning. Victor Slade, face partially turned, standing outside a building she recognized. She had told Quan she would stay in the building. What Quan had not asked, and she had not answered, was whether staying in the building meant she was finished contributing to this investigation. And what she knew, sitting in the briefing room with 32 hours of no sleep behind her and Pratt's willingness to talk, and a warrant being confirmed for a property 40 miles away, was that Pratt knew things about Slade's documentation that would take Torres's team days to fully develop. She also knew something Torres's team didn't. She had worked alongside Gerald Forsyth for 4 years. She had reviewed his quarterly documentation. She had seen the architecture of how he built things, the redundancies he liked, the specific way he structured backup documentation in case a primary source was compromised. If Forsyth had built the documentation infrastructure for Slade's second network, there was a backup source. Not in any of the institutional records at Harlow Ridge, not in the Wyoming entity, not in anything that had been seized or was being traced through financial channels. Forsyth always put his redundancy somewhere analog, physical, a place that wasn't connected to any digital infrastructure that could be monitored. She had seen him do it once, at Portsmouth, a filing system he kept in a storage unit in a suburb of the city under an entity name so generic it would never generate a flag. Personal records, he'd called it. He'd shown it to her in the context of an audit review, and she had noted it and filed it and forgotten it for 4 years. She was not forgetting it now. She pulled out her phone. She opened the encrypted channel to Faro. She typed, "Forsyth maintains analog redundancy storage. Separate from the network documentation. Portsmouth precedent. Personal storage entity, generic registration. He has one for this operation. I'd bet on it." She sent it and put the phone down and looked at the evidence board. 40 miles away, an NCIS team was positioning outside a property where Victor Slade was either present or had recently been. Kwan's warrant was being confirmed. Pratt was in a room somewhere in this building, talking to Torres about 6 years of documentation practices. And somewhere in Montana, 40 miles away, or less, or somewhere else entirely, was a storage location that contained the physical backup of everything Gerald Forsyth had built. And if Slade knew it existed and Forsyth was in custody, then the most important thing Slade could do before the net closed around him was get to that storage first. Her phone buzzed. "Faro, can you locate it?" She thought about a suburb outside Portsmouth, Virginia. A storage facility. A unit number she had not tried to remember and had remembered anyway. She thought about how Forsyth built things, the patterns, the specific preferences. She typed back, "Working on it." She looked at the evidence board for a long moment, and then she picked up her phone and called a number she had not called in 4 years. A number that belonged to a woman named Sandra Orr, who had been the administrative coordinator for the Portsmouth Medical Supply Chain Review, who had helped Claire navigate 6 different institutional filing systems across a 14-month audit period, and who had, once, in a conversation that had meant nothing at the time, mentioned that Forsyth kept his backup documentation in a unit at a facility called Mountain Row Storage in a town called Mill Haven. The phone rang twice. "Sandra," she said when it picked up, "it's Claire Voss. I need a favor and I need it in the next 10 minutes. Sandra Orr picked up on the second ring and said, "Claire Voss," with the particular tone of someone who had not expected to hear a voice and was recalibrating in real time. "It's been 4 years. I know. I'm sorry to call like this. Are you in trouble?" "Not personally. I need something from you and I need it fast and I can't explain everything right now. Do you trust me?" A pause. Sandra had been a meticulous, careful woman, the kind who double-checked everything and trusted people only after they had demonstrated they were worth trusting. Claire had spent 14 months earning that, one audit review at a time. "Yes," Sandra said. "Millhaven, Mountain Row Storage, the unit Forsyth used for his backup documentation. Do you still have the unit number? You mentioned it once during the Phase 3 review. I need to know if you remember it." Another pause, longer. Claire heard the sound of Sandra moving, a chair, something being set down. "Why do you need that?" "Gerald Forsyth was arrested this morning at Harlow Ridge Veterans Medical Center in Montana. He's been running a supply chain diversion network through veterans hospitals for 6 years. Victor Slade is the primary. If Forsyth has a backup documentation cache at that storage unit, and if Slade gets there before a federal team does." "Unit 47, Sandra said. "I remember because he asked me once to forward mail for a personal entity. The name was Bridgewater Records Management. I thought it was odd at the time. I should have—" "You couldn't have known," Claire said. "Thank you, Sandra." She was already composing the message to Faro before the call ended. "Unit 47, Mountain Row Storage, Mill Haven. Entity name, Bridgewater Records Management. Forsyth's backup cache. Slade may move on it before the Grover Creek warrant clears." She sent it. She set the phone on the briefing room table and waited, watching the evidence board, watching the clock on the wall move from 3:12 to 3:14 to 3:17, the particular patience of someone who had given information to the people who needed it and had nothing left to do but let the machinery run. Pharaoh's response came at 3:19. Relaying to Quan, stand by. At 3:24, Quan came back into the briefing room. He looked at her with the expression of a man who had just substantially revised his understanding of what she was. How long have you known about the Millhaven unit? He said. 20 minutes, she said. I called someone who had proximity to Forsyth's administrative practices at Portsmouth. She remembered the entity name and the unit number from a mail forwarding request. Quan was quiet for a moment. The Grover Creek property. Our team is in position. Warrant confirmed 8 minutes ago. He paused. Millhaven is 60 miles from Grover Creek. If Slade is at the property and he knows about the storage unit, he knows, she said. Forsyth built it as a failsafe. Slade knows every part of what Forsyth built. Quan pulled his phone. He stepped to the window and made a call, his voice low and precise, the operational language of someone moving pieces that she could no longer directly observe. She sat in the briefing room and she thought about the clock and the 60 miles between Grover Creek and Millhaven and the specific patience that men like Victor Slade carried. The patience that had let him rebuild once from Coronado, that had let him position Forsyth and Mercer and Pratt in a configuration that had nearly held. Nearly. At 3:41 p.m., Quan's phone rang. He answered, listened for 40 seconds without speaking, and then said, confirmed, process the scene. He ended the call and turned to look at her. Grover Creek, he said. Slade was there. He was in the process of leaving when the team moved on the property. He paused, the specific pause of someone delivering information precisely. They found him in a vehicle with documents and 2 hard drives. He attempted to negotiate passage. He was taken into custody at 3:38 p.m. She sat with that for a moment. 32 hours ago, she had been on the shoulder of a highway with a spiral notebook and a phone call she hadn't expected. Roland Mercer had been inside a building he had controlled for 6 years. Gerald Forsyth had been a name she had not thought about in 2 years. Victor Slade had been a case marked closed. The Millhaven unit, she said. Team is en route. We'll have it secured within the hour. Quan looked at her steadily. Whatever's in that unit will significantly advance the cases against all 3 of them, including the 7 other facilities, he paused. You gave us that. Sandra Orr gave us that, Claire said. She was the one who remembered. Quan almost smiled. It was a small thing, a fraction of an expression, but it was there. Go home, Whitmore. Get some sleep. You're going to need to be available for the prosecution team in the coming weeks, but today is done. She stood. Her legs were solid now. The accounting had been paid earlier, apparently, on a hallway chair. She picked up her jacket from the back of the chair. Quan, she said. He looked up. Kevin Pratt. He's 27 years old, and he was recruited by a man who specializes in recruiting people who don't understand what they're agreeing to. He cooperated voluntarily, whatever weight that carries in the process. It'll be noted, Quan said. I can't promise outcomes, but it'll be noted. She nodded. She left the briefing room. The East Wing was quieter now, the evidence processing winding down, the NCIS vehicles in the parking lot beginning to thin. The hospital had the quality of a place returning to itself, the rhythms of patient care reasserting over the disruption of the last 20 hours. She was in the main corridor heading toward the exit when she heard her name. Not Whitmore, not Voss, just Claire. Danny was at the nurse's station, still in the same scrubs, the particular stubbornness of someone who had refused to go home when people had told her to. She looked tired and anxious and relieved in the specific mixture that belonged to someone who had been waiting for a conclusion they hadn't been certain would arrive. You're still here, Claire said. You're still here, Danny said back, which was unarguable. Claire stopped at the station. She looked at Danny, really looked at her, the way she hadn't always made time for in 14 months of 12-hour shifts and deliberate quiet. 24 years old, 8 months into a career she was good at. A woman who had handed over her access card with an unsteady hand because she trusted someone and who had been right to. Mercer, Danny said. They're saying he was arrested. He was arrested. Danny's exhale was the kind that carried something with it. Not just relief, but the release of something that had been held under pressure for months. The specific weight of someone who had been taking the long hallway for weeks and had never told anyone why. The HR complaint, Claire said. The record of his conduct. Mercer's department has been under federal review since this morning. Everything he filed, everything he processed, it's all going to be examined. What he did to you, the pattern of it, that's going to be part of the record. Danny looked at the station surface for a moment. I should have filed something. You were 23 and he ran security, Claire said. Don't do that to yourself. You filed something. You pushed back. I had a different set of tools for it, she paused, and I got suspended. Something moved across Danny's face, something that wasn't quite a laugh but was adjacent to it, the dark humor of a terrible situation seen from the other side. You got suspended and then you basically helped take down a 6-year federal fraud operation. There were a lot of other people involved in that, Claire said, but you started it. She had started it with a spiral notebook and a habit of looking at things other people didn't look at. She thought about that. The 14 weeks of documentation that had seemed, in the moments of accumulating them, like a small and private act of stubbornness. A thing she had done because she could not do it, because her specific type of mind required it, because the numbers had not added up, and that fact had lodged in her the way incorrect numbers always lodged in her, immovable until resolved. Go home, Danny, she said. Actually, this time. Danny looked at her. Are you coming back? She thought about Carolyn Webb saying we'll expect you back on shift when you're ready, and Quan saying you're going to need to be available for the prosecution team, and Pharaoh using her actual first name on a highway shoulder in the dark. Yes, she said. She slept for 11 hours. She woke at 3 a.m. in the same apartment she had been living in for 14 months. Small, practical. The framed photograph she had never unpacked still in the duffel bag in the closet. The truck outside needing a new alternator she had been meaning to replace for 6 weeks. She lay in the dark and let the silence be what it was, which was just silence, not the loaded silence of a building where something was wrong. Her phone had 14 messages. She read 3 of them. One from Pharaoh, Millhaven unit confirmed. Documentation recovered. Prosecution team estimate this advances the case by months. Well done. One from a number she didn't recognize that turned out to be Warren Tibbs, who had apparently gotten her contact from Pharaoh, which she was going to have a conversation with Pharaoh about. The message said only, "Thank you." WT1 from Quan's office, formal, requesting her availability for a deposition the following Thursday. She set the phone down. She looked at the ceiling. She had not thought, when she had moved to Harlow Ridge, that this was where she would end up. Not in any specific sense, but in the general sense of being visible again. She had constructed the life here around a deliberate invisibility, and the deliberateness of it had been real. She had wanted the quiet. She had wanted the patience and the night shifts and the slow accumulation of small, meaningful things. After years of large, meaningful things that had cost her and the people around her in ways she was still occasionally accounting for. And then Roland Mercer had cornered Danny in a corridor, and she had walked toward it instead of away, and 14 months of careful quiet had begun their unraveling. She did not regret it. That surprised her a little. She had expected to feel some version of grief for the life she had been building. The small, particular shape of it. The nurses who recognized her in the hall, the night shifts with their own rhythm. But what she felt instead was something more complicated, and, if she was honest about it, something closer to relief. As if the deliberate quiet had been a thing she had imposed on herself out of discipline rather than desire, and the imposition had finally run its course. She got up at 5 and made coffee, and sat at the kitchen table with it in the dark, and thought about the 11 people currently in federal custody or processing across 3 states, because a delivery log had not added up, and she had written it down. She thought about what Forsyth had said in the receiving bay. You were good at the reviews. You caught things other people missed. She thought about Quan's almost smile. She thought about Danny, 24, taking the long hallway for months because the short one was occupied by a man who had decided he was entitled to make her uncomfortable. And nobody had done anything, not because nobody cared, but because the institutional weight of Roland Mercer's position had made caring feel insufficient. It had taken someone who had experience with the specific architecture of institutional power, how it was built, how it was maintained, where its actual load-bearing points were, to dismantle it. That was the thing nobody talked about. Not about courage, not about the cinematic version of standing up. The actual version of it was patient and unglamorous, and involved a spiral notebook and a low-grade administrative fight that she had lost before she had won it. It involved getting suspended and driving to the shoulder of a highway and sitting with the engine running for 4 minutes. It involved 14 weeks of writing down numbers that nobody else was looking at, alone, without knowing whether it would ever matter. It had mattered. The weeks that followed were not a straight line. The prosecution cases across the 7 facilities generated a federal investigation that Torres described, in the dry language of institutional process, as one of the more significant veterans' healthcare supply chain fraud cases in the past decade. She gave depositions. She answered questions. She reviewed documents and pointed at specific entries and explained, in plain language, why they indicated what she said they indicated. Roland Mercer's attorney attempted, in his initial response filing, to characterize the events of the parking lot as a misunderstanding and Claire's actions as those of a disgruntled former employee engaged in a campaign of harassment. Torres had forwarded this to her as a courtesy, with a brief note. The parking lot camera footage was recovered, clear and complete. She had looked at the note for a moment and then set it aside. Some things resolved themselves. Gerald Forsyth entered a cooperation agreement. His testimony was extensive and, according to Kwan, significantly accelerated the prosecution timeline. He had been coerced to begin with and had then made choices, and both of those things were true simultaneously, and the legal system would weigh them imperfectly, but would weigh them. That was the best that could be said. Kevin Pratt cooperated fully. His lawyer negotiated a reduced charge in exchange for complete testimony. He was 27, and he had stood in a parking lot and not said anything when he should have. And he had put an agent on the floor in a storage vault, and he had also ultimately put the weapon on the table when asked. The legal system would weigh that imperfectly too. She had given her statement about his voluntary cooperation and left the rest to the process. Victor Slade's attorney entered a not guilty plea and announced plans to contest the admissibility of the Grover Creek evidence. Kwan had described this with the same dry precision he used for everything. He'll spend the next 2 years in that process before he runs out of road. She had looked at Slade's booking photograph in the federal case filing. Silver-haired, composed, the expression of a man who was already calculating the next move. And she had thought about Coronado, about the evidentiary gap that had let him walk the first time. And she had thought about the Millhaven storage unit and its 47 boxes of physical documentation that Sandra Orr's good memory had led them to. There was no evidentiary gap this time. She went back to work on a Thursday, 3 weeks after the arrests. The morning shift. She had not done mornings in 14 months, but her schedule had been rebuilt from scratch by a nursing coordinator who had gone out of her way to ask what Claire preferred and then done her best to accommodate it, which was a small institutional courtesy that she found, unexpectedly, moving. The hospital looked the same. It smelled the same, antiseptic and industrial coffee, and the particular warm air smell of a building full of people. The parking lot was just a parking lot again, not a place where something had happened. The East Wing corridor was a corridor, not a scene. Carolyn Webb was in the main lobby when Claire badged through the front entrance. An actual badge, a new one. Her photograph taken 2 days ago by a staff coordinator who had said welcome back with the particular warmth of someone who meant it. Webb saw her and crossed the lobby. "Ms. Whitmore," she said. Then, "Or is it Commander Voss? I've been uncertain about the right thing to call you." "Whitmore," Claire said. "It's always been Whitmore here." Webb nodded. She had the quality, Claire had decided, of someone who paid attention to the distinction between what was true and what was convenient, and tried to honor the former. "The board met yesterday," Webb said. "I want you to know what was decided, because it affects you directly." She paused. "We've established a formal staff advocacy position, a permanent role with direct board access and independent reporting authority, specifically for concerns about institutional conduct. It was recommended by the federal oversight team as part of the hospital's corrective action plan." Another pause. "I'd like to offer it to you, alongside your nursing duties, not instead of them. You've indicated you want to continue direct patient care." Claire looked at her. She thought about the consultation room at 4 in the morning, Webb saying, "I want to understand the shape of what happened here." She thought about Danny's hand with the access card, not entirely steady. She thought about 14 weeks of a spiral notebook and nobody asking the right questions because there was no formal structure for asking them. "Who would I report to?" she said. "The board chair," Webb said, "directly." "And the scope?" "Any staff concern, any institutional conduct issue, any pattern that someone in this building notices and doesn't know what to do with." Webb held her gaze. "We are trying to build a structure that doesn't depend on someone with your specific background deciding to keep a notebook. We would like that structure to exist for people who don't have your background. Claire was quiet for a moment. The lobby moved around them. Morning shift arrivals, the sound of the PA system beginning its daily rhythm, a family at the reception desk with the particular careful posture of people who were here for something they had been dreading. "Yes," she said. The first morning back on the floor was not graceful. She had been away 3 weeks and the unit had shifted in small ways. A new medication protocol, 2 new patients whose charts she needed to learn, a supply cabinet that had been reorganized in a way that made no logical sense, and which she mentioned to the charge nurse with enough specificity that it was reorganized back by noon. Danny was on the afternoon shift. She appeared at the nurse's station at 2 p.m., saw Claire, and said nothing for a moment, just looked at her with the uncomplicated relief of someone who had been waiting for a thing and was glad to see it. "You're back," she said. "I'm back." "Morning shift. That's new." "I'm branching out." Danny smiled, a real one, the kind that reached the corners. She looked different than she had in the corridor 3 weeks ago, different than she had looked for the weeks before that, the weeks of long hallways and monitored posture, and the careful management of a situation that should never have required management. She looked like herself, which was different from looking like someone who was constantly calculating how much space they were allowed to take up. "A patient asked about you," Danny said. "Kept asking the night staff where the nurse was. Described you pretty specifically. Dark hair, doesn't smile for no reason." "Which patient?" "Room 9, Marine, 2 tours. He's been here 6 weeks and he's been difficult with everyone. It was less difficult with you, apparently." Claire looked down the corridor toward room 9. "I'll check on him. He bit 3 different nurses' heads off this morning." "He's allowed to be angry," she said. "He just needs someone to say that to him without flinching." She went down the corridor. Behind her, she heard Danny say something quietly to another nurse. She couldn't make out the words, only the tone, which was the tone of someone telling a story they wanted the other person to understand correctly. Room 9 had a man in it named Garrett Huss, 53, 2 tours in Fallujah. Surgical repair of a spinal injury sustained in a vehicle rollover that was not combat-related, and which he appeared to resent on principle, the injury and the non-combat nature of it, both. He was sitting up in his bed when she came through the door, and he looked at her with the particular assessment of someone who had been evaluating people's capacity to handle him for 6 weeks. "You're back," he said. "I am." "They said you had some kind of situation." "I did." He looked at her for a moment. "Did you handle it?" She pulled the vitals cart toward her. "I did." "Good." He watched her check his blood pressure. "You're the only one on this floor who doesn't look at me like I'm a problem they have to get through." "You're not a problem," she said. "You're a person who's in pain and you're angry about it, and that's a reasonable response." He was quiet. His blood pressure was slightly elevated. She noted it, not alarmed. "The physical therapy rotation is at 3, she said. "I looked at your chart. You've been declining it. It hurts." "I know it does." "You don't know. I know what surgical spinal rehab requires," she said evenly. "I've been in operating theaters during procedures like yours, and I've seen the recovery in field settings where you didn't have the luxury of declining the PT." She met his eyes directly. "It's going to hurt whether you do the PT or not. The difference is whether the hurt is productive." He stared at her. Something moved through his expression. Resistance, and under it, something that had been waiting to be addressed honestly rather than carefully. 3 o'clock, he said. "I'll check in at 4, she said. She left the room and went back to the station and picked up the next chart, and the morning continued the way mornings did in a hospital, imperfect and human and full of the specific weight of other people's difficulty, which she had always found easier to carry than her own. Farrow came to Harlow Ridge in April. He drove up from Billings. She hadn't known he was coming until he called from the parking lot, which was very much how Farrow operated. She met him outside in the same parking lot where Mercer had stood with his sidearm 2 months ago. The lot was different in April. Mud instead of ice, the mountain range visible clearly for the first time in weeks now that the winter cloud cover had lifted. It looked like what it was, which was a large parking lot in front of a veterans hospital in rural Montana, and it looked completely ordinary. Farrow was grayer than she'd thought when she saw him in the corridor of Harlow Ridge at 4 in the morning. The gray suited him. He had always had the quality of someone who would age well. You look less destroyed than I expected, he said. Thank you. It was a compliment. He looked at the building. How is it? Good, she said. It's good. The staff advocacy role. Word travels. Quan mentioned it. He looked at her sideways. You're staying. I'm staying. He nodded slowly. The Navy offered you a reinstatement pathway. I know because I was asked to deliver the message. I know, she said. I got the message. He was quiet for a moment. A truck pulled into the lot, a young couple getting out with the particular careful movement of people visiting someone who was sick and didn't know how the visit would go. She watched them cross to the entrance. You don't want to come back, Pharaoh said. Not a judgment, just the statement of someone who had expected to be there and wasn't going to pretend otherwise. I'm already back, she said. This is just a different version of it. He looked at her for a long moment. She had worked alongside Dennis Pharaoh in positions where the nearest friendly unit was 40 minutes out and the margin for error was nothing. And she had trusted him the way you trusted people who had demonstrated, under conditions that tested it, that they would not leave you in the wrong place. That trust was not diminished by the fact that they were standing in a parking lot in Montana and she was in a nursing uniform, and the work she was doing was measured in recovery timelines and physical therapy attendance rather than operational outcomes. You were the best medical operator I worked with, he said. I meant it when I said it. I know. This is also good work. I know that too. She looked at him. Was there another reason you came, or just to deliver the Navy's message in person? Quan wanted me to tell you the Millhaven documentation sealed the Forsyth case. The prosecution expects a plea before trial. Slade's attorney dropped the admissibility contest last week. Apparently the physical evidence from the unit is too extensive to fight. He paused. Mercer's trial date is set for September. She nodded. All three facilities where board members had undisclosed relationships with Mercer's supply contacts have been referred for independent governance review. He paused again, longer this time, the pause of someone who had one more thing. There's a staff coordinator at a veterans facility in Idaho, one of the 7, who identified an irregular supply pattern in her facility 7 months ago. She documented it. She didn't know who to report it to, and nothing happened. He looked at her. She's been referred to Harlow Ridge's staff advocacy office as a potential model for what her facility needs to build. Claire was quiet. 7 months. This woman had been looking at numbers that didn't add up and writing them down for 7 months, alone, without knowing if it mattered. What's her name? Claire said. Huang. Ellen Huang. I'll call her. The last week of April, the Harlow Ridge Courier, which was a small regional paper that ran twice a week and rarely generated stories that left the county, published a piece about the federal investigation. It ran on page 1, above the fold, under the headline, Hospital Nurses' Records Helped Break 6-State Veterans Fraud Network. The photograph they used was one taken from the hospital's staff directory, her official badge photo, slightly overexposed. Her expression, the particular neutral of someone who knew a photograph was being taken and had decided to cooperate with it minimally. She read the article once. It was accurate in most of the material facts and imprecise in some of the narrative connective tissue, which was typical of journalism and not worth correcting. It described her background in terms that were specific enough to establish the context. Former naval officer, decorated service record, medical specialist, without delving into the operational details that were not public. It quoted Carolyn Webb. We failed to listen when we should have. The fact that this came to light at all is because of one person's willingness to pay attention when it would have been easier not to. It quoted Danny. She had not expected that. The quote was short. She walked toward the problem when everyone else was looking away. That's just who she is. The paper also ran a sidebar with a photograph of Roland Mercer's booking record, and a timeline of the federal cases, and a brief description of the staff advocacy role that had been created at Harlow Ridge as part of the corrective action plan. The sidebar described the role as the first of its kind at a veterans medical facility in the state. She read that part twice. The phone rang 20 minutes later. It was Ellen Huang calling from Idaho, who had read the article online and said, I wasn't sure anyone would actually call me, with the voice of someone who had been holding something alone for a long time and was not sure what to do with the fact that someone else now knew about it. I said I would call, Claire said. I know, A pause. 7 months. I've been sitting on this for 7 months, and I didn't know if it would matter. It matters, Claire said. Tell me what you have. She listened for 40 minutes. She took notes. Not in a spiral notebook. She had bought a proper records binder for the staff advocacy role, one with labeled sections and proper pagination, which was the institutional version of the same habit. Ellen Huang had documented 3 irregular supply patterns across 7 months, with dates and quantities and comparison data that was more detailed than anything Claire had produced in the first 6 weeks of her own documentation. This is good work, Claire said. This is very good work. I didn't know if it matters, she said again. I'm going to connect you with Agent Torres at NCIS. He's going to want to talk to you, and I want to make sure you know before that conversation happens that what you've done here is significant. The fact that you kept going for 7 months without knowing if anyone was looking, that's the part nobody sees. But it's the part that actually holds everything up. Silence on the other end. The particular silence of someone absorbing something they needed to hear. She thought about a highway shoulder in February, a truck engine running, a heart rate coming down to where it needed to be. She thought about the particular quality of doing the right thing in the absence of any confirmation that it was going to matter. The daily act of picking up the pen and writing down the number and adding it to the record without knowing what the record would eventually become. That was the thing people didn't talk about. Not the moment of confrontation, not the parking lot, not room 14B at 11 p.m. The thing that nobody saw was the months before it. The choosing, every day, to keep paying attention when it would have been easier and quieter and far less costly to look away. Some people called that courage. She thought it was something more specific than that, and less dramatic. It was the refusal to accept that the things you noticed didn't count because nobody else had noticed them yet. Thank you for not letting it go, Claire said. Ellen Huang said, thank you for calling. Well, on a Tuesday in early May, Garrett Huss was discharged. He walked out under his own power, slowly, with a cane, his back not what it had been, and unlikely to return to what it had been, but functional, upright. He had done every PT session after that first afternoon, had done them with the particular grimness of a man who resented the necessity but understood the logic. She had checked in at 4 o'clock after each of them, and he had never said much, but he had been there. She was at the nurse's station when he came down the corridor toward the exit, cane and the small duffel bag that a family member had brought. A woman behind him, who was probably a sister. He stopped at the station. You're leaving, she said. Apparently. He looked at her. You gonna be here? For a while. He nodded once. The sister was waiting, patient and quiet, the posture of someone who had done a great deal of waiting and was still practicing it. He shifted the duffel on his shoulder. You didn't treat me like I was made of something breakable, he said. You weren't. No. He looked at her with the directness of someone who had decided to say the thing rather than not say it. Most people, when they see someone who's angry, they get careful. They back up. You didn't. Backing up didn't seem useful. He almost smiled. It was the same almost smile she had seen from Quan in the briefing room, the fractional expression of someone whose face was not accustomed to the full version of it. No, he said. It wouldn't have been. He picked up the duffel properly. Take care of yourself. You too, she said. He left. The lobby doors opened and let in a rectangle of May air, brief and cool, and then closed. She stood at the nurse's station for a moment and let the corridor be what it was, a corridor, with its noise and its movement and its particular human weight, the ongoing traffic of people who were hurt, and people who were helping, and people who were somewhere in between. She had spent 10 years learning how to keep people alive in the worst conditions available. She had spent 14 months learning how to do it in a different way, in a building in rural Montana, in blue scrubs, in the specific difficulty of daily institutional life, where the threats were less dramatic but no less real. She had been suspended and reinstated. She had been dismissed and proven right. She had been called powerless by a man who was currently awaiting federal prosecution, and she had been called the best by a man who did not give that assessment easily. None of those things, she had come to understand, were what defined her. What defined her was simpler and less interesting from the outside. She paid attention, and she wrote it down, and she did not stop when it got hard. That was it. That was the whole of it. The PA system called her name, her actual name, Whitmore, for a patient on the second floor. She picked up her tablet, noted the time, and went. The hospital moved around her and she moved through it. And the work was imperfect, and the days were long, and the people were difficult in the specific human ways that people were always difficult. And none of it asked her to be anything other than exactly what she was. That had always been enough. It still was.